What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Representing the Resin. My name is Jameson Wellborn, and today we are joined by Josh and Jeff of Swamp Hash. Boys, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, man. Happy to be
Appreciate
here.
Absolutely, guys. Where are you joining us from?
Marquette, Michigan.
The Upper Peninsula, right?
Yeah, the Upper Peninsula.
Let's
Michigan.
go.
Yep.
So I connected with Josh at Regen a few years back in Michigan, and I was just blown away not only by just his energy, but also his resin and just the community in Michigan, the quality there. It really blew me away, and so I've been chasing Josh for almost a year to come on the show, and I know he's had a lot of life events and things happening, and so I'm super stoked to have you guys on. Jeff, I want to start with you. On the show we like to start at the beginning, so tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from and where you grew up.
All right, so I'm originally from Illinois, Antioch, Illinois, small town. It's like halfway between Chicago and Milwaukee. So I always had like the best of being able to go to the cities, but it's kind of a more rural area. If anybody knows where it's at, it's right on the border of Wisconsin. So I've got the woods right in the backyard, but kind of a way enough from the city folks, so it's nice.
And so what was childhood like? Like, were your parents working in rural industries, or were they commuting into the city? Like, how did that work?
So my mom was lucky enough to be a stay-at-home working. She had a accounting firm that she worked for, a couple hospitals. And so she was able to be a stay-at-home mom during a time when, before being able to work from online was cool enough like it is nowadays. And so I had a lot of time to be able to spend with my mom. And my dad, he had to work a lot, did lineman. He was a line worker on the telephone poles for ComMed. And that took a lot of time. It's a crazy job. Like, works like 16-hour days, like 18-hour days. Will get called out on storm shifts right after getting home. It's like a storm. He's getting called out at like 3 a.m. He's got to go back out and work again. And it's just honestly crazy. And so he had always worked kind of jobs like that, and outdoor jobs. Like, first when he got out of high school was just doing tree jobs, and then transitioned into the lineman work. And so that was pretty much his life from there, and kind of where I was destined if I was going to be staying home and didn't come up to Marquette, honestly. And I'm glad that I did not go that route.
So, I mean, what was school like for you? Were you a good student? Did you enjoy it?
I was good enough. I didn't really try. I could get good grades just from kind of being there and not really trying. My teachers really liked me. Just for me, I could goof around and do whatever the fuck I wanted, really. So that was nice, and still had the respect of teachers and all my friends and stuff too. And I'd say middle school was great. High school was also good. Spent time with a lot of friends. I didn't play any sports in middle school or anything, just kind of like skateboarded and rode my bike around and hit dirt jumps and stuff like that, and snuck cigarettes in the woods.
I think, similar to many of us. When did you become aware of cannabis? Did you have some older brothers or siblings that kind of helped that happen, or was it through friends? How'd that process take place?
Yeah, I think it was through friends, like older brothers, really. I think first time I ever saw it was like in middle school. We were back hanging out and riding on our dirt jumps that we had, these like huge dirt jumps in the woods, like just massive, too big for us kids to be jumping on, really. And my friends had some weed, and I did not smoke it at that time. I was kind of just like, I see this, I respect it, and I know that it's going to be a huge part of my life. Like, I specifically remember thinking that and saying that at that time. I'm like, I know I'm going to love it, and it's going to be a part of my life someday. And then, a couple of years later in high school, then it was on.
That's super interesting. So, like, was that from media that you picked up growing up, or like, you know, at that age where you're like, no, not now, but I know, you know, I'm gonna be dancing with that lady soon. Where do you think that came from?
I think maybe it could have been some like media and things like that, but I think also just kind of the vibes that my friends were having like at that time, like definitely was some media influence at that time, you know. And but I liked how, you know, my friends were feeling, acting, you know, and I was like, this feels like, I feel like once I start that, I'm gonna keep on that path. And you know, I love the
100%,
plant.
100%, man. So talk to me about how that relationship started. Talk to me about the first time in high school.
Oh, the first time. So I think I remember like one of my best buddies, like Vinny, we were gonna smoke together or whatever, and then he ended up smoking at this party that we were at, and I didn't know the night that he did. And then so the next day we went out and we got another bag like with our other friend, and I was like, oh shit, okay, we're gonna smoke now. And like it ended up being some like strawberry cough. It was super fire. And so I'm being from the Chicago, like north of Chicago area, we always had just really good bud, you know, like I always had all the name strains like that you can think of from California and stuff because it's being shipped in all the time. Um, but that was always kind of lucky to have that situation. So I always had that. Kind of went like only had a little bit of brick weed from some of my friends' brothers had that, you know, like $5 gram stuff, which was nice, and then could get the fire too every now and then. But we went over to my friend's house and we just ended up rolling up a joint of this stuff and smoked it in his garage. And then we all just got geeked out, high, you know, laughing, had the best time, turned on some music in the basement and grooving and just had the wild ass time, you know.
Oh
Fun
yeah,
first time. Definitely got really high.
that's awesome. So, I mean, what happened after that first time? Was it an immediate relationship that transpired, or was it kind of something that slowly graduated into something more serious?
It was something that was like right away, you know, I felt connected with me. It connected with my body and my mind, and just absolutely fell in love with it, and kept smoking every day since that. Trying to find it. You know, sometimes smoking too much, but you know, we have a respect for it now.
100%, man. I think, you know, a lot of us sort of find the plant like that. So where was your head at coming out of high school? Were you confused and not really sure what you wanted to do, or did you have a clear plan and vision in mind?
Kind of like in the household that, you know, parents are like, you're going to go to college. And, you know, even though I had no idea what I was going to do in college, and feel like I always suggest to people that are going to school like that to take time to realize what you want to actually do, you know, and don't waste time. But sometimes it's the journey of being there as well that lets you realize what you actually want to be doing, which is kind of what happened with me. I started out doing business management as a freshman and sophomore, and then I remember I went to my first day of accounting and I was like, fuck this shit, I need to get out of here right now. And like they like starting to gear me towards the real business school part of it, like with all the corporate mentality and stuff. And I was like, I cannot even get into 1 minute of this. This is not my style. And went and switched to environmental studies and sustainability after that, and that's kind of what I ended up with.
And did you find that program rewarding, or, you know,
For sure.
Yeah.
It definitely like aligned with my like ideals about the world, and wanting to be the best that I can for it and give back and kind of regenerate it in any way that I can. And that came about, like, they always asked us to like think about in that major specifically, because it was kind of just like a geography type social major, so it wasn't like much, so you had to make it your own and make it your thing. So I was like, the thing that I think makes the most sense and that I can do, like, that is going to always be the best for this world, is growing food and giving back to the land, taking yourself out of the equation, which is kind of where my head was at in that deal. Got some jobs doing like U.S. Forest Service and conservation work and stuff like that, and then finally fell into farming at an urban farm in Grand Rapids. It was called
So
Urban Roots.
you first out of university worked with the Forest Service?
Yeah.
So what'd you do there?
I built trails and like hiking trails and mountain bike trails, and then tended to like the campgrounds and like rec areas and stuff like that. It was pretty chill.
So where was cannabis throughout this time in university through environmental studies? Like, had it kind of taken a back seat? Was it still very prevalent? Were you involved in the legacy space? Like, what did that look like?
It was always prevalent in my life. I would always just be, it was always prevalent in my life, always smoking, selling little bags here and there just for friends, mainly us getting together and throwing down on stuff. Would move a little bit for friends here and there through college. And then afterwards is really when it started out more for me, and getting, more into like when I was in the Forest Service, I'd move a little bit more for some other friends. And then when I moved to Grand Rapids, was when I kind of got into growing, and that's kind of when things started spiraling with me, in that I was growing veggies and I was growing pot at the same time.
So how'd you end up growing? Like, was it an opportunity for somebody at somebody else's operation, or was it,
it was, I just got my government check and I was like, I want to start growing. And then I bought a few tents and some lights and did my whole setup, and like killed my first grow. And friends that had grown before were just stoked on it. They were asking if it was my first grow or whatever, and I was like, yeah, it is. But I just was so into like the soil already with what I was doing, and like that, it just felt so natural to be able to just switch right to that plant. And that's where my journey kind of began in like 2018 is when I first started growing.
Talk to me a little bit about the vegetable grow that you were working on.
It was an urban farm, about an acre in Grand Rapids, all bio-intensive style. Like it's a regenerative style, using like compost from the land, double digging with broad forks, no heavy equipment or anything like that. And kind of like intensely planting with vegetables. And it was a nonprofit organization in the area that we donated food to the local shelters, and also gave the community in the surrounding area food and discounted price food at our market that we had. It was like bulk food and stuff like that.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Were you growing in beds, or like I've seen those urban farms do some really cool stuff in like socks, like almost like soil rolled out in socks?
So it was all in beds. Like the owner who did it, he did like 60 20 by 4 foot double dug beds, which double digging is like you dig 3 feet down in the soil, and then you take a spading fork and then dig the rest of that out, kind of like to loosen up the soil. So these beds are like 5 foot deep of like uncompacted soil each, and they're all just like super productive. The farm had like a composting program that we'd pick up scraps from food around Grand Rapids and stuff like that. And yeah,
that's super cool. So what were the first plants you grew? Were you growing from clone or from seed?
I grew from clone. I got a couple clones from my friend who I was living with at the time. He had some friends who I had Northern Lights 5 and Kosher Kush, and those are the first two that I had at that time.
That's very
cool. Yeah.
So you guys, Swamp Hash came together, and you connected with Josh in is it 2019?
Yeah, I'd say probably even 2018. One of our mutual friends, I had stopped back out at his place, and he's like, you should really come and see my friend. You should really come and meet my friend Josh out here. He's like, he was in the same group of friends as me, and then our paths just never crossed ever. And then I was like, I always heard about Squimpy. His name's Squimpy too. And he took me out there one day, and I was just like, damn man, this is the farm, this is the life. And kind of worked in. I was like, I love this place, and just kind of fell in love with the farm, honestly. And he invited me back to harvest that year, and then I had came back a couple of years more after that, and then moved up
That-
2019.
So how long between your finishing your first tank row and connecting with Josh?
It's like probably a year.
And so you were just continuing kind of like honing your skills, working on
Yeah.
indoor, and then when you went out to see Josh, were you helping with the harvest that season?
Yeah, I was helping him with the harvest that season. Yep.
Very cool. Very cool. That's super awesome. So I want to turn it over to Josh, man. I want to switch gears a little bit. Josh, tell me about yourself. Like, where'd you grow up?
All right. Well, I grew up in the UP, so it was pretty rural, a lot of woods and hanging out in the woods and riding four-wheelers, and got into snowboarding pretty early and racing dirt bikes and stuff. And
What's your parents do?
my dad worked at the mill, so it was like mill life for him. And they were separated early, so I had kind of like a split dual thing where it was a lot more strict at mom's, and they ran a hotel in town, so I kind of got to see a little bit of that in the resort. As a young kid, I was tending to some of the landscaping and mowing the lawns and doing a lot of the flower watering and stuff like that, just kind of being a kid trying to keep me busy. And then probably like it wasn't until like ninth grade, I think I started really, figuring out that cannabis was like going to be really a thing in my life. I had smelt it and seen it before, through middle school and whatnot, and like started drinking and stuff. But cannabis kind of really was like, I remember the first time I smelt it, it was like, man, this just smells like my dad's house, like this, because my whole family is tied in, everyone smokes and it's all one big happy family. Obviously not everyone, but we have a good relationship with a lot of the uncles and cousins, and it's just kind of something that's always, tied us together and brought us in.
So was that your awareness of the plant? Did that go back like to very young childhood where you could that smell was present? And
not really. Maybe like in elementary school, maybe I remember this one time seeing like some leaves on the table after my dad probably had a party, and maybe it was up too late while I was there, and being like, man, why would someone bring like the outside in and like put it on the table and like break it up? And I remember just kind of like squishing it off the table and talking to my buddy at school, and him being like, man, I'm pretty sure that was weed. Like, you should take that next time, and I'm like, oh, well, I haven't seen it again. I didn't really see it. My dad, that was like a one-time thing almost, like, until later.
So you said grade 9 or ninth grade, you kind of come to the realization that cannabis was going to be a major part of your life. How did you get there? Like, what was your first experience consuming?
Yeah, like, so early on, my buddy, good pal, brought me in, and was like, you're just basically going to do this. He was kind of like one of those guys that was like, I got this and this is cool, and if you're going to hang out at night, this is what we're going to do. So it kind of, turned on to that, which I'm grateful. I mean, I don't know how long I would have went without him being there. Probably a few more years, but maybe not. But I remember just being like, man, and help, and then like, kind of like getting in some trouble, but still having cannabis around and like keeping it on me and being kind of like, well, I need this at night, and then being kind of almost like an introverted smoker at one point where I was just using it myself, and I'd go in on some bags with some friends and stuff, but like mainly just being like, I gotta have it for night, like this is like what I do when I calm down. And it's just kind of always been that kind of like,
was it a sleep thing? Was it a calm?
um,
What was it?
pretty much a sleep thing, yeah, and like just calming thing. Like, I got some minor medical issues with like my back and spine and leg and stuff, and that's kind of like what really led me into medical. I realized I was like, I'm going to be in pain for the rest of my life. So I might as well start here unless I want to be on painkillers or opiates, and saw all that coming from a small town. It's pretty prevalent, to get on something like that and just kind of fizzle away. So grateful for cannabis kind of keeping me away from that and always being like my saving grace in the pain department, and just being just like a friend, honestly, like always being there, always being around.
100%, bro. Were you drawn to cultivation and soil and like gardening of all kinds of things, or was that something that you had no interest in growing up?
Growing up, like we always had a garden, with my mom in the back, small little food garden, and it was always kind of like one of our things. And one of my babysitters early on was really into gardening, and then looking back and being like, wow, like that was like a pretty good permaculture, setup, a lot of intertwined intense plants. And I remember spending a lot of time back there and almost being like, this is kind of like a Zen garden, in my mind as a child, and like being really relaxed, playing in the dirt. And it wasn't until, I remember when medical came around, my uncles and old man and stuff all got their card. And I was like, well, that means we're gonna start growing, like we got to put a plant in the house. And I came home with some plants to my dad's house, and he was just like, no, like we're not gonna do that, like that, like what are you doing? Like I'm just like, I don't know, I got a closet, like I've heard, you can grow stuff, indoors. And so it wasn't until I moved out finally, and until I got into cultivating, for real.
So I mean, what was high school like for you? Did you enjoy it?
I enjoyed high school for sure. I enjoyed learning and having a deeper sense of just knowledge, and it was really kind of easy for me. So like I didn't have to really try as much as others. So I was kind of always picking kind of like the easier classes because I knew it would be like, oh, I can take this and it'll be easy, instead of being like, oh, I can get in the accelerated class. I'd be like, no, 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 like I don't want none of that. Like keep me in the box. I don't want to be separated. But like in high school, I took a lot of technical. We took like PC Tech, which was like a class that kind of introduced me to like Photoshop and building computers and stuff like that, which I didn't really pursue the computer building. But when I went on to college, I kind of took some graphic communication classes and like got into the arts. And senior year, it was funny because I didn't take an art class my whole time because I'm just like goofing around, and I took all art classes because I was able to, just with my classes being, I was fine basically to go. And I remember just being like, man, like this is something I probably should take a little bit more time. People do this like on another level. So I've always had appreciation of like the arts and that side of things, and looking at it like school kind of like that.
What did you take in school? Like what you were coming out of high school? What was your chosen?
I went to college. Actually, I was like, okay, I'm gonna get out of here. I was one of those kids that was like, I'm sick of this small town stuff. I'm gonna go see what it's like. And I moved to Minnesota with a few buddies who was on the wrestling team. And it was one of those situations where like you're looking at the thing on the computer and you're like, there's a pool and like there's all this nice stuff like a laundromat, and then you get there and it's like there's a shopping cart in the pool and it's green and like there's like people hanging out in the yard, and like it was a pretty not ideal situation. But it was like, hey, we're coming out here and we're gonna give it a try. So that was when like things changed. Like in high school, remember it was like my first job. I think I was in the kitchen and they were kind of like these death metal kind of more dudes, and I was kind of always into music, like in all kinds, like rap music and death metal, and then eventually into bluegrass and the Dead and all that. But I remember getting this little piece of hash, like this little block, and being like, and passing and being like, here you go, like try this out, and I'm just like, man, like I don't know what that is, like I'm not sure, like I'd prick weed and stuff, around. So I take it to my buddies, and they're like, "Oh man, that's some hash," you know. So like, that's when they showed me how to, put it on the nail, wine glass, and I remember, like 11th, 12th grade, sometime in there, smoking on some bubble hash and being like, "Oh man, like this is like it's kind of like wine, this is the next level. Like this is a little bit more of what we're after. So now we don't have to smoke, a whole bag of weed. We just smoke this little bit of hash and we're good to go." And then, it was normally brickweed, and then we had a lot of green, just like skunky, like sticky bud that would come around in the fall because all like the old timers were growing, around, and it was just always been around, just like the garden green kind of like skunk bud. And I remember some of that in high school. I'm not sure if it was that, skunk that people are talking about, but it was pretty loud to the point where if you had it in your car in high school, people were smelling it outside your car, that type of weed. So that would come around every once in a while. And then like 2008 medical came in and people started growing indoors, and, we started seeing some better weed. And like, some of the first weed I think was like, it was a lot of TGA stuff, I think it was like, I remember, Space Queen and like Plushberry and stuff like that. And then when I moved to Minnesota, it was like you'd go to buy weed and it was like, oh, now it's like $500 an ounce, and we're like, whoa, whoa, like I've never even seen it. Like I don't even know what you're talking about. Like I can't afford that, kind of thing. And then just like having the saving grace of like, having family, being able to come visit and bring me a little bit of the homegrown and being like, finally, at least I can roll up now and not have to like smoke pinchies, and oneies and stuff. And but there was a lot of Blue Dream and Green Crack, and I remember like Headband and stuff like that was like some of the first good stuff I seen coming into the city from living in the sticks all those years.
And how long were you in Minnesota?
It was a really short stint, and it was like got into the roommate thing, and then had to move in some new people, and the only people we knew were really the people that were selling weed. So it was like, hey, you guys, you want to come move into our house? Like, and we ran a party house for a few months there right out of high school, which was really fun. And I was out of there in like 2 semesters. I was back home, and I remember being like, man, I'm gonna go home and start growing some weed. Like I remember telling people that, like, I'm gonna move back home, and that's what I'm gonna do. And basically, I moved home, living with my parents maybe for a month or two, and I was back in one of my friend's brother's house, growing some weed and getting my feet wet, just being like living in the spare room, kind of being eyes on what he's doing, watching it while he's gone, kind of thing. And then it wasn't until I was probably like 20 then, moving out of there into a house myself, being like, okay, well, I need to be the guy, now because I have some experience. I think I can do this. And I was looking at houses, and I'm at this house, and all of a sudden, he brings me down in the basement, and I'm like, okay, like what's going on down here? And he's like, open that bookshelf. And it was like a Scooby Doo kind of style bookshelf, with like water and a drain. And like, I'm like, all right, like I'm renting this place, it was cheap. And like, I was like, all right. And that was my first like true experience with like, on my own. And, I had, I think, some like diesel bud from BC Bud Depot or something, and then I remember moving into like getting some TGA seeds, and growing like the uh, cleaners and like Space Queen, like I said, we dove into a lot of that, like stuff like that.
Did you have any mentors at the time?
At that time, I was kind of just like going off of my buddy, shout out Paisley Acres. He was bouncing back from California and kind of, giving us information and kind of like spouting, like being like, well, this is what's going on, this is what we're doing. And I'd be like, okay, like, and I had a few other buddies, that were on the same level. And then I was working at Pizza Hut for a little while in high school. And then after high school, this finally, the guy comes to me and is like, hey, I got some stuff I've been working on. And then that was, he he'd teach me. He gave me like the Grow Bible, and I started learning like reading books, and it was a lot of reading a lot of stuff and kind of like trial and error. And I started out with like Fox Farm, Dynagrow, like typical stuff, like changing it up, just whatever they tell me at the grocery store. I'd be like, well, what do I want, and they just selling me the next thing until I smelled some. This was still in that house because I remember it was in that basement, and a guy came over and was like, yo, like I grow organic and you should smell some of my weed, after I was all stoked about this harvest. And at that point, I'm like, oh, my weed, smells like good weed, good bud. But then this guy comes over and I'm like, man, like this stuff smells different. Like, yeah, that stuff smells like that, and that stuff smells like that, and that smells like that. And then you're telling me this has blueberry in it and I can smell blueberries, and that at that point I was like, I don't care about yields, I don't care about anything. I just care about the flavor and what it tastes like. And at that point, I've been just moving, organic, just from, or Nectar for the Gods, and then moving to like TLO, and then finally, ultimately just basically outdoor, building my own soil with hugelkultur, and ultimately where we're at today, doing a big mixture of Korean natural farming, Jadam, and basically just observation of the forest and taking, big molding piles of wood chips we got. Like, so the timeline, I kind of getting ahead of myself here.
Yeah, I was just about to jump in and back you up because there's a lot that you just touched on that I want to dive very deeply into, which is the evolution of your cultivation methodology, which I know you've spent a lot of time on, and I know you put a lot of thought into. So why don't you take us back and talk about that first house you moved into, and how big was that grow behind that bookshelf?
So that was like 2 lights, high pressure sodium, 600 watts. I wasn't really blowing the doors off quite yet. And then I remember getting, another tent and then moving into the bedroom and being like, okay, now I have veg and flour, and then from there, I think there was a year where then finally my uncle kind of took me in and was like, hey, like, you should check out what I got going on. And so then I went over there in between moving up north, kind of around where I'm at now. And I worked for him for a few years, just kind of, being harvest guy. He'd bring me in during harvest. I'd know, he'd have like 72, big outdoor plants, and we'd take them down and trim them up. And it was all wet trim at that point, and he was just drying, and he was getting a really good price for it too. This was, back in the day when it was still, could really make you. And he was growing a lot of like blueberries and Cindy 99s and, like Flying Dutchman, I recall him being one of the things on the list, but he liked to make a lot of stuff up. So it was like, he'd just smell the plant and he'd be like, oh, this is this one, or like this one's like the moldiest, the mold free one, or like. And when early on, we didn't see much bud rot until we started growing a lot, and still we started being like, okay, people don't really want this, like, old school stuff. We got to start bringing in some new stuff. And that's when we started, really freaking out about like bud rot and, seeing a lot of that. And because he was growing, like Northern Lights.
When did you start seeing that, Josh? Like what year?
Let's see. I have a little timeline on my phone here. I'm kind of, if you don't mind me catching back.
Absolutely. Because I'm interested now, because that's when the market's demanding new flavors, and you're probably either bringing in Cali cuts or hunting packs that are sifted from material was bred indoors.
Yep, for sure, definitely. That was like 2012, 2013.
Yeah.
And that was like the first time I actually like made bubble, was like there, in his garage. And we'd, we were like, oh, let's get the biggest bags we can get, and we got like 44-gallon bags. And like we had a big drill press, because he worked in a machine shop, and he like really could understand, like, oh, we got to go big. Like, So we take the can, and I remember it on a cart, and we were just kind of like moving this around, the big paint mixer on the stationary drill press, because he had all these tools, and he was kind of like handy like that. And so like there was a lot of ingenuity I saw, through his, growing and the stuff that he did, and learned a lot of things. And then there was a point, where I was like, okay, like we're gonna have to start changing, and that's like he let me grow my own garden. And that was like, a turning point for me, because then I started being able to see my direct impact on what I was doing to the plant, and be like, oh, if I take more time doing this, I get more, more pruning, more airflow, and we started kind of nailing some of these strains that were, rotting because of, maybe just like planting it and letting it go, it just wasn't quite working as much, and it was a
You were,
lot of,
sorry, go ahead.
and I think it was to do like, the first few years, I remember we took all this swamp dirt, from like the pond. He was digging a pond. So we took all that out. We took all this stuff, cleared this little area, and it was like this real rich black dirt. And I remember it being so fluffy by the time he was done that he had like screwed screws into his sandals so he could walk around on it, because he was sick of, it was like he needed some traction so he wouldn't keep sinking in so much. And I remember ever since then, it just kind of like needed something, like, and it's just, probably needed more forest, now that I know what I know now. Should just kept putting the forest back in.
100%. So, like, were you, talk to me about that first time washing hash? Was that something that was very impactful for you, or was it kind of a, a non-event that, and it wasn't until later that you kind of fell in love with the magic in the process?
Well, I had always been really stoked on getting all of the excess material that I could, like I'd be there and I'd be trimming my best, trying to be the best trimmer, having the biggest pile. And then eventually I'd be like, yo, what are you doing with this trim? And he was just burning it, he would just throw it out in the yard and, do whatever with it. So finally I started collecting it. And I'd make butter, for the first year, and I'd always have butter, and I always do, But then, like, that one year, I remember these guys came in and they're making hash, and I'm, at that point, I'm like, well, I'm the top trimmer now, like I'm gonna sit here and keep my head down and grind. But I'm still watching, seeing what they're doing. And I remember that year they made like, this big softball style bubble hash, and they dried it out and put it on top of the fridge. And then, at the end of harvest, I was like, hey, can I get some of that hash for some of my payment? And we broke it down, and there was just a big white mold in the middle of it, and that's when right there I was like, well, that was a mistake. I'll always remember, keep it thin and dry, and you gotta, actually keep an eye on that if you're gonna want to make it, if you can't do that. And and then it was, so I've always been kind of like trim, scrap guy, trying to clean up what I could and make what I can off of that. And I really think that's where a lot of my excess stuff really was coming from. My grows never really made that much. I was growing in tents and stuff, and like, because I got up maybe to like six lights at a time, but no real rotation. And like, I was just looking forward to that next, outdoor harvest so I could come up again and, have more, opportunity and, have access to material. And then, I want to say it was like, that's when kind of BHO kind of came around, was like my buddy, brought the idea with from California to us and was like, hey, this is what's going on, making this honey oil. And so then we went through that whole thing and blasted and open blasting, and learned a lot, about just resin and like quality, between buds and trim and, old stuff and, what you're going to get. But all in all, it's like, I always had, that love for the keef and the bud, and like that, like keef was always my head stash, so it was always like just basically having a little extra work, and having that little bit of equipment to be able to pull it off. And so, did that for a few years, and then I ended up moving back up north to college again and was like, okay, I'm gonna do college again. Move my tents and all that up there, and
What was the catalyst for that decision? Was that pressure from outside forces, or
just kind of like living in my small town again and being, turning 21 and being like, man, like I could see myself sticking around here and buying a house, not that it's a bad thing, but it was just not what I was imagining, I started growing my hair out, wearing tie dyes, it was going to shows, having leftover show gear around at the house was kind of like a little bit risque, hanging out in town. And it was just, being in a college town is just a little bit more, our style. And I knew there was a lot more like-minded people up there. And it was just, overall would just be, if I'm going to stay around, that was just going to be where I was going to be, or I was going to check out and just be like, I'm just going to go out in the woods. And, I had a camp that was just in the middle of nowhere. And I'm like, well, I'm glad I didn't do that, because I really probably wouldn't know anybody at that point, probably still be out there.
So okay, so you pack up your tent. Are you at the point where you're like, you've got moms that you're like, I've got to keep these moms alive, or where?
Um, I feel like at that point I'm still kind of like maybe delusional about like the gear I'm keeping around. So I don't really remember quite what I had at that time. That's kind of like a blurry time. I feel like I was just popping seeds. I remember being like, oh, maybe we're going to do autoflowers, and having like another roommate helping me out. And, that never really worked out at that time, because it was like, I'd always rented, another room. It was always like me and some people, or me and another person, and then our grow. And me, I always moved with the grow, and it was kind of like my third roommate, at all times. Like I always had an extra room, an extra space.
Yeah.
So,
What did you take in school?
graphic communication, for a little while, and just kind of got into like graphics and doing design work and stuff like that. And I took a lot of ceramics classes, and like, just kind of like dove into what I wanted to do, which was basically not much. Like I really just didn't want to end up, having to go back home to the mill, or, or have to end up, working, full time for the man or something. But in that time, I was working at a pasty shop, which I put in, about 5 years in there, which I learned a lot about food safety, and a lot about, because they did shipping and meat. So there's a lot of inspectors, and all that. So I gotta say, I learned a lot of like what I do now in the hash room from working there during those times in college, and being, having to keep things tidy, and, having to keep track of things, and just kind of like overall having, the most productive situation basically happen, and that was a good time for me, working there. And then I moved from that house, still in college, to another house. And I remember being like, okay, this is our big house. I'm going to start something big here. And then ended up being like, well, another guy moved in, and then another guy moved in, and we were, big into snowboarding and hanging out. And it just ended up being a party house again. And so my little grow up in the attic really didn't get much time. And it really was, I still put in 1 year. I was still bouncing back to my uncle's at that point in the fall, to get my work in and do my trimming and get my, trim and stuff. So I always had that. And it wasn't until let's see here. And at that point I was growing GDP. Like I had a one plant that was my like girl, and that was GDP. And I remember it because it was my friend. He was kind of like, no one can get this cut. And I'm like, all right, cool, let me get some weed. So I ended up getting a few ounces from him, and there was just a seed in it. And I'm just like, oh, one seed. And I popped it, female, and it was pretty much an identical female of what I had. And he was, kind of like confused about it. Like, did you like get a cut from my friend, or like, do you know my guy, like my guy? And just being like, no, like, I got my seed, and then, had my mom. And I remember the GDP was kind of like a thing carried with me into a few outdoor seasons, and from that house, and kind of like really like made me realize what could happen outdoors and what it could look like, real hard nugs and loud, purple and grape.
Did you
But
take did you take it back to your uncle?
yeah, I remember, I'd bring everything back to my uncle, and he would be like, you know, get it mixed up, or like he'd grow it out and be like, yeah, it was all right, and like, and it was kind of to the point where he was getting. I was by the time I was, my last season with my uncle, I could tell he was getting a little bit over it, like the falls were getting a little long, and it was getting a little bit, the payout wasn't as much, so it was like, this isn't worth it. Like, the first time coming to trim camp, I remember it was like my aunt made all this food, it was real. God, bless them, being, so open, and like, just like, because they've been out west, they seen what it was like, and what you had to do to get people to work for you. And so it was really cool, being catered, and, learning a lot about trimming and like what people wanted and what people didn't want and how to break it down. And but then the seasons, it'd be like, you having a bed, and maybe sleeping in the garage, and then maybe like just kind of like less and less wanting that situation to last that long, just kind of like, it's one thing to have growing plants all summer and then harvesting them and then everyone going away, but then having to trim them and break it down, and by like Thanksgiving, everyone's finally checking out, which I kind of took on that responsibility after they were done, and just kind of like, it was about time.
Absolutely. So did you finish your second attempt or stint in post-secondary education?
So the college thing, let's see here. So in the college days, I really didn't end up finishing. I think I ended up with like an associate's degree in like liberal arts or whatever. Like I did a few years of school, and it took me a lot more than a few years. But I wanted to touch on something during those times, as I was, the hair straightener days, during the BHO years, I was always, running this hair straightener and being like, man, like, this stuff is so flavorful, and just being like, this is something different than, the BHO. And it was always, keeping it for head stash. And I remember the black dog being one of those strains that it was just like trimming it, and then you lift up your trim band and you'd be like, man, like there's so much on there, like we gotta do something. So like I remember, coining stuff with the pollen press, and then getting into, squishing it with just parchment, and then figuring out we need a bag, and then setting up like a double hair straightener jig with like a piece of wood so you could step on it, and get a couple of them bending at the same time. And like there was some pretty funny times of, partying in the room and having a stack to here of parchment paper on the table and being like, whoa, watch out with the torch, like I gotta reuse all those, like that's like there's stuff on that I haven't collected yet.
Did you see the soil grown video, or did somebody show you the hair straightener tech, or
Someone showed me, I'm sure, I think it was my buddy Tyler that was really adamant about it, but we were always trying new things, and as a group, and just kind of like messing around. And then came the big move. So then I didn't really finish. I was kind of like, I'm done, with this college thing. Like there's a lot of partying going on, and I was kind of like, I seen what was happening and where a lot of direction was going, and it was like, this could happen forever. Like we could hang out here, and party, and this could last a really long time, and that was, it could have been fine. But I was ready, to make a move, and I was vending pasties because I started being like getting in the festival scene, and I'd bring the pasties I was making at the shop out, and we'd start selling them, and I'd bring bubble hash to the festivals, and it was kind of like bubble hash and pasties, like it was kind of like my thing, every time I leave town.
For the listeners who don't know, what is a pasty?
Okay, so a pasty is like flour and lard and water crust with meat, potato, onion, rutabaga on the inside, and it was originally, I think it like Cornish and English in the mining communities where you would, basically put in all the leftovers or whatever you got in this crust and bake it. And then you're left with this hand pie, so to say, that you can eat, deep in the mine and have all that nutrition, and it would stay warm a long time. And it's just kind of been a staple up here in our community because there's a lot of mining. So it's just kind of like one of those, touristy things that kind of is a staple for also locals. And, it's just like one of those things that like you'll find them in a few different places, like in some ski resort towns and like other mining cultures, around the United States and stuff. But I've never seen so many pasty shops than up in the Upper Peninsula, that's for sure.
Very cool. Okay, so what happened? You're on the festival route. Where does it go from there?
Festival route, bringing pasties around, heating them up at the campsite, kind of, figure it, from my experience, just kind of being like, well, we got to do something to get stuff, like we can trade, we can do all this stuff, and kind of learning, the whole barter system and kind of like, getting a little bit of knowledge on kind of how things work in the real world, and I always remember I'd be all, tuned up at night and I'd have my bubble hash and pasties and I'd just listen for torches and I'd be like, well, I know people are smoking weed over there. They're probably dabbing, but then I could always sell someone on a bubble hash ball. Like it was always like, we're going to buy one from this guy. Just, I don't know if it's pure, just like get this guy out of here or like, they're like, wow, I haven't seen one of those in forever, because it's kind of like, nostalgic to some folk. They like, it brings them back and they're like, man, like this reminds me of, all kinds of stuff depending on their age, like, and their culture, because it's just like a lot of people in America just don't treat, bubble hash like it's treated around the world.
Was it fish? Was it string cheese? Was it any specific or just any?
So I mean, our first big show was Cheese and Widespread Panic, and that kind of like set me on, that was the big first like festival, but like we'd see, we were seeing Green Sky Bluegrass and like, we seen, Billy Strings kind of like coming up and like, being in Michigan and traveling around and a lot of Railroad Earth and, a lot of jam band, kind of like string bands are kind of like my thing. I kind of like a little more of just like relaxing time, more than, a high paced, crazy time was just a little bit more what I ended up on. But yeah, definitely, Widespread Panic and Billy Strings and Green Sky Bluegrass, a lot of bluegrass music. And then, I always liked Jerry's, all his off stuff, like Old and in the Way and like all the, side work that he did, just kind of, more of the farm vibe.
How long did you stay on tour?
I wasn't really on tour. It's just mainly just jumping on shows, here and there, just as I could get money together. We'd go down as a group and see as much things as we could. And it probably wasn't until I just kind of like stopped seeing music when I got the property, and that was kind of like when I kind of like honed down and like just kind of like focused on farming as more of like a lifestyle and reality and less of like a fantasy. It's kind of like, this is it, I'm gonna do this. If I'm gonna be broke, I'm gonna do it. If it's gonna work, it might be all right. But
well, let's back up from the property a little bit before we talk there. So moving back down, did you move back to the same place you grew up in? Did you move to a different town? What was your next?
So from that house, yeah, shout out all my friends in college. That was a great time. Like that to me, that was some good shit. But so from there, I met this guy like at the house. Like I went and vended my pasties because I was like, oh, I can vend pasties at a local campground, and I'm like, all right, I'm hanging out here for the weekend. And it was like country music and rock music. And then my friend's band was playing, later that night. And so we're hanging out, and the first night, like I met this guy, and it was like 4 a.m, and he's, an older gentleman, and he's on his bike, and he comes over, and he's like, telling me about his farm and his property and all this stuff. And I'm just like, all right, cool, man. Like, let's hang out. So we're hanging out, and he's telling me, about his problems and glaucoma, and having these issues, and having growing weed and being in the medical. I always had a soft spot for anyone, that need help. So just kind of like, it's like, all right, well, maybe I'm gonna start, helping this guy out. And it was the last night of that festival. He's kind of hanging around, I'm kind of observing him, just being like, oh, this guy, never really had an older friend, about 50, and like that, and I check out of my vending stand. I'm like, I'm done. I'm gonna go out. I'm gonna go party. And then after the van stopped, I looked over and there's a bunch of commotion over at my farm stand, or at my passy stand. And I'm like, what's going on? And I walk over there, and the guy is slanging the pasties out of the cooler, and he's making, and people are paying for it. And I'm like, whoa, this is really, what's going on, and he's like, oh, here's all the money, and like, people wanted food, and I saw what you're doing, and like, I thought, this was, and I was like, all right, cool. And so then I trusted him at that point. I was like, this guy didn't take anything from me, and he could have done whatever he wanted, and I was like, wow, like, so the next morning I see him packing up his tent, and I'm like, you want to ride home, I'm like, let's bring you back to wherever you came from. And so I bring him back to this farm he was talking about, and the farm, we get there, and it's like, man, this is like a burnt down trailer, and like a lot of trees cut down and stuff. And it's 23 acres, back in this reservoir where, like, there's a long driveway with a big swamp on both sides, pretty rough, flooded area at times. And he's just living in this camper. And I'm like, man, like, all right, like, I feel like I'm, gonna see this guy again, and like, there was all these, crazy piles of garbage, burnt, and just like, your typical, like, hermit kind of life. Had no one, there really to check up on him. And so then I'm like, I'm gonna start hanging out with this guy. And so I'm coming back and forth from my house, and he'll ride his bike into town, and it's like, 20, 30 miles, and like, he'd just show up in town, and I'd be like, oh, sweet, like, he's here, and then we'd be hanging out. And then eventually I was like, why don't you become my patient, just because I do this thing, and like, I have patients, and I'm not really like looking for them, but we could maybe try to do something. So then, that was my last year working with my uncle, still in college, um, still living in that house. And I moved. He called me up one day because we started looking for property. At that point, I had some money, and I'm like, we're gonna buy a property, and I'm gonna start growing, like my uncle showed me to. Like, just gonna keep going with what we do. And he'd come around, and he'd ride with me to the properties, and he'd be like, checking them out. And it took a few months of him doing that, and finally he called me up, and he was like, it looks like you're pretty serious about buying property. And I was like, yeah. And he's like, well, I guess I'd sell you mine. And I was just like, no way, just kind of like almost floored by it. It's like, that's not gonna happen. Kind of ignored it for a while, and and then he kept pestering me about it, and I'm like, all right, man, like, how much, and then we worked out a deal and a contract, and ended up getting all the legal stuff taken care of. And I moved out of that house straight into his property with no, there's just a burnt down house, no clearing. There's a garage with no floor. It's just sand, a lot of rabbit poops, a lot of rabbit living in there. And so we're like, let's give her a go. Like, sorry, unc, like, I got my own spot, kind of thing. Like, I'm gonna be doing my own thing now. And that was a wild summer. That was the summer that started the swamp and how it all kind of started. And that was 2016. And
Wow.
yeah,
Cool. That's a cool story.
Yeah. So then we move out there, just kind of like grab all the stuff. I'm like moving out. I had a girlfriend at the time, still my girlfriend now. We got a nice little family out here. It's evolved in quite a thing. But so at that time, I'm like she's on the road and she's with her friend, and they're, you know, just touring the West Coast, kind of hanging out after college. And I'm like, hey, I got this property. Like, I need a dog, you know, like we need a dog on the farm. So then she picks up this dog, Millie, and or it wasn't Millie, it was just a random dog at that point. And stray dog had, you know, fleas and worms and was really malnourished and just kind of like overall like sketchy, honestly. And when she gets back to the farm, like at this point it's like I'm all stressed out, you know, trying to get the farm going. I got this old man, you know, he's still living on the property, and you know, I got a bunch of friends that move out there with me, so I'm kind of, you know, holding down the fort. And we got, you know, camp going on, tents and all this. And all of a sudden we're like, man, like Millie's pregnant, like geez. And so we had puppies, you know, like living in a tent and having the garage with no floor, no doors. So like having those puppies was like, man, like we're really here, you know, like this is it, like we're on the farm now, you know, like so we ended up keeping one of the puppies. And then at that point the puppies were like a big move, because like I'd go to work and I'd come back and it'd just be like, all right, count the puppies, count the plants, you know, just kind of be like, hope everything's there. Like it's kind of wild, you know, who knows who's gonna show up, kind of thing. And so then we end up building a shack, a 10 by 12 little shack thing. And me and Jamie and the puppies move into there, and we're kind of holding it down. You know, we're living the good life now. We're out of the tent and we're living in the shack. You know, it's not insulated or anything. It's just like, you know, walls and a door. And you know, we made it into the point where I could get the floor poured in the garage. And I'm like, you know, that's going to be huge if we get cement in the garage, because we need a place to dry all this stuff. You know, we don't have electricity out there yet. I'm running water from the ponds and the reservoirs. You know, I'm scooting water around.
Because you're cultivating this whole time.
We went in that summer, that spring, cleaned up, and got area cleared and got plants in the ground that summer that we were in on the property. And it was basically like digging holes in the sand, because it's all sand now, mind you. Once we get there, like there's a sand pit. And so I get a guy that I'm working with's husband, you know, comes out and gives us a hand, you know, gives us a really good deal on excavating, and clears us a little spot. But he, you know, clears all the sand pit out and levels it, because it was kind of like where they were digging out, and he was selling sand kind of on the side. And so we made all these tiers. And so in the first year I'm like, oh great, the guy left and now we have all this sand. And it's like, oh, it's almost like the desert, you know, because we're like a quarter mile from the beach, you know, on Lake Superior, so we're pretty close to the water. So it's really sandy right there. And we just basically dug holes. And I like, the only thing I could think of was put liner in and basically build like a pot in the ground, and then put, you know, bag soil in there like I was doing indoors, and just kind of rocked it off. And that first season, you know, we were sleeping in the garage with our floor, running the dehues on generator, you know, filled the whole thing up. Like, me and Jamie were talking about this the other day, like looking up and there's just plants, you know, just hanging there over our bed, and having puppies. And you know, that first season was wild, man. It was like one to remember, that's for sure.
Incredible.
Yeah.
And how did it finish? Did it successfully?
Yeah, you know, wasn't bad. You know, at that point I'm running PVC on like 4x4s cemented in the ground, you know, so it's just kind of like really, you know, do it yourself, kind of scrap together. And it worked out. You know, we pulled it off. You know, it probably wasn't as best as we could, but then at that point it was like, okay, now, you know, it's like it's getting real, because now it's like we're living in the shed and we got this harvest. You know, what are we gonna do? Like, we got to make a move. So we almost ended up having to bail on the property that winter, but then ended up, you know, crunch time came down and we ended up making things happen. And we had a trailer move in that December, and we were like permanent. You know, we're like, all right, we're not going anywhere now. And so it's like we got a 1978 mobile home out here, and you know, the garage, and that's, you know, what we've been rocking ever since.
That's awesome, man. That's super cool. So what was the next, so that winter you secure the mobile home, and then does that take you to 2017?
Yep, that would be 2017. And
And
so then that year, 2016 was interesting when I was thinking about, the strains that I was growing. I had all these tester seeds I got from my buddy G Grade, and it was like a bunch of Gromer stuff, and it was banana breath, peanut butter breath, meat breath, and gorilla breath, and all that stuff turned out really well, and it was a lot of good stuff that I was like, man, like a lot of that stuff came out to be pretty well known, genetics that have done well for a lot of different crosses and people's work. So I was grateful to have good genetics in that first run, and kind of like not put my money in on a bunch of cuts. I was glad that I put the seed down and was like, this is gonna work out. And definitely started learning more about like keeping the genetics around and how important that was, and how we needed to get something going, because we can't just do that every year, and start over from scratch.
were you like, that's what I was just going to ask you, like with that running from seed, are you holding moms? Are you cutting clones in the third week of flower? Like, how were you managing that, if at all?
That first season, no, we didn't take any cuts or anything. We pretty much lost everything, and was just like, this is what we got, it's all, that's all we're gonna run with, and it's kind of over. And like we were so stressed on the other stuff we had, we were to the point where it was like, just going and getting warm water at the gas station was a treat. And like we were drinking an all spring water from the spring down the road, so we were pretty wild at that point. So it was like, if we could just, survive this season, I think we're going to be all right. So that first year, no, we didn't end up keeping anything. That was the end of the GDP. That was the end of, that era of
You lost the GDP that year.
lots of GDP that year. Yep. Yep.
So what happened next?
So then next was, I was like, man, I got to do something about this soil. Like, I can't just buy all this topsoil, like, and just from the grocery store or whatever. It's going to cost me a fortune. So we started, a local farmer of my friend was kind of like, why don't you do hugelkultur? He's like, I heard of this thing. He's like, you should maybe give it a try. You got a lot of maples, and like, you should just try doing, more lasagna layering and like kind of like building soil rather than, worrying about buying all this stuff. And so then I started, 2017 was when we got chickens, and we started making hugelkultur. And then we started really being like, okay, we can get local topsoil, we can get the ingredients, and we can layer it and make it work for us without having to get it. We were still using bag soil for top dressing and stuff like that, for like quick fixes, but it was mainly trying to figure out, what a low input and low, cost we could really do. And that's kind of like when I, started learning about like comfrey and the fertility and comfrey and how it's used as a fertilizer, and all the healing properties of that. And I started transplanting that all over the property, basically marking plant holes with comfrey, so then you can chop and drop, and put those nutrients right there, or cut and make teas and, FPJs. And
Who are you getting the information from at this time?
so at that time, I make the hugelkultur because of my friend Dan, and then I kind of look into, I start really realizing, who, Josh and Kelly are, Dragonfly Earth Medicine, and you know Jadam and KNF, the Cho family, and everyone, Chris Trump, and I start, really honing in on the potential to making fertilizer, and just being like, okay, there's, we start making bokashi, and we start focusing on EM1, and start, putting together that relationship of being like, you need a little bit of this stuff and you might not need it all, type of thing. There's a few key ingredients here, and then, kind of let the plant do the rest. Because it's like, as I'm always really interested in herbs and like, how they express their terpenes. So like with growing other herbs, you want them to be in kind of like an extremer condition in order to express their full characteristic of what the plant wants to express, similar like in sage and lavender, these things are grown in extreme conditions because you get a higher count of, the oils and the things that you're going after. So I kind of started thinking about it like that, like maybe so much not feeding the plant, but letting the plant take what it needs and then giving it, say compost or, something simple. And that's when it started really starting to click.
Absolutely. And at what point? So that was the 2017. That was the 2016 season. What was the 2017 season like for you?
So 2017 was like we started um let's see. I think that was a year of like the Red Hindu Jaeger. And like when we started getting, we started looking into like, whoa, we get like some of these really unique terpenes that like people really don't have never seen before, like our Red Hindu Jaeger was really like strawberry, heavy. And it was like when I'd make it into BHO, it was like, man, this is very unstable. And that's when I started realizing that some of our strains, like it was like I could purge it for as long as I wanted, flip it, break it up, different temperatures, different scenarios, and it would still be, you know, like slick or slippery, and that's when I started being like, okay, like high terpene, less stable type of situation, and thinking about it like that. And that year, it was kind of I don't that was kind of like more of a year of like rebuilding, and I started, working on a farm nearby, so I started getting more knowledge on like market farming, and I started, learning about like farming in a straight line, and kind of like production farming, and getting kind of like introduced to the farmers market and stuff like that. And so it's kind of like that year was a little bit of a rebuilding year. We're kind of bouncing back from that first year. Kind of took a lot, to get to that point, and we're still kind of like trying to figure stuff out. But going into 2000, that was like I don't have many. I can't really recall that year very well for some reason. It's like,
All right, man. I'd
um,
be hard pressed to recall all the years like that.
yeah,
So
but
you grow the Jaeger, and you're kind of associating the volatile or the level of terpenes with the instability of the BHO. 2018, you end up connecting with Jeff. Did that happen early in the year, or did that happen later in the year?
um, so actually going back on 2017, that was another year I think we grew the Black Dog, and where we start really starting to be like, okay, like the rosin is better than the BHO for us. Like we enjoy it more, but we can't convey it to the customer yet. It was kind of like, okay, what is this? Get kind of chalky sometimes, and it would be like dried out. We try to package it in like parchment and be like, it wouldn't stay the same as like the BHO would, and I'd get it all dried out, and it was just like, figuring all that out, but kind of like making a decision and being like, this is something we should probably take more serious moving forward because, we like it so much and we feel the effects of it. And we're like, this is something we really like. And we kind of are like, and that's still like trying to be like, okay, how do we make it look more like BHO, or how do we get it to look more like the current market of like what's going on and like trying to move in that direction. But
And
then,
were you seeking information outside of your circles? Like, were you or one of your friends or associates on the forums or looking online to try and find individuals that were giving out or sharing some of this information, or was it pretty insulated?
so I was, online looking at stuff, and I don't really BC, Bubble Man always, having the information, always out there, seeing his YouTube videos and on the forums and stuff. But then it was a lot of it, I learned with my buddy Paisley Acres. We kind of like have always been, parallel in our journey and kind of just like learning off each other. And then, another buddy, Aranya Farms, was right there, always like bouncing ideas back and forth and kind of like, and I remember 2018 was when we were like, there's a freeze dryer out there, we're kind of like, okay, we weren't even making bubble hash at that point. We were just like, okay, there's a freeze dryer. We're making sift rosin, let's, try it out. And we went into that journey and basically was like, fuck, like this sucks. Like we've ruined a bunch of shit, and like it's like, not taking the time to look into the details of like changing the shelf temperature and or being like, okay, there needs to be some water in the material. You don't want to dry it out completely, like you do if you're going to do it on the pizza box with the parchment, and just that whole learning curve with the freeze dryer kind of turned us off to where we were like, that's kind of hard. Like we're not really sure about that yet, like so then we start putting food in it and doing some weird stuff. And yeah, it wasn't. And then that year was the year that we started learning about like bending greenhouses and getting into more real stuff where we're like, okay, we're going to ditch this PVC stuff, and we're going to start bending our own hoops and try and phase that out. And that year, we were more like, okay, hash is a thing. Like we're going to kind of gear ourselves up for, trying to find something that's like, because we don't want to just rely on, BHO. We need something that's, we weren't even really sure of the differences in gas and extraction at that point. We just knew that like we needed more hash stuff. So we started looking for like, I had Skywalker, like Death Star and Mandarin Dream, and like still had the Red Hindu. And then we brought the Gorilla Breath back. I had some seeds of that hidden away from that first year, brought that back. And that was the first year that we started throwing the light depth down and was like, okay, it's one thing to grow full term, and then it's another thing to pull the tarp and finish in August, where it's so gnarly up here that like it's almost like take it when you can kind of thing, and when it comes to the fall. So I think the light depth really started changing our plan because we were like, we can now run some of these longer strains that have a little bit bigger head and pull them off, and they actually look like indoor. And it was like, wow, that's kind of crazy. That was like the first time we started realizing like, you can pull off some pretty nice stuff with the sun.
Yeah, I think depths, a well done depth is very hard to distinguish from indoor.
For sure.
What I want to ask you about bending hoops, like was that something that you were shown by somebody in your local area, or was that information you had to go out and seek out? Like how'd you get into that?
Um, I remember like knowing that you could do it, and being like, okay, you can build your own greenhouse. You had, the kits are on Johnny's, and kind of from other farmers, they'd be like, hey, like I've heard, no one's really doing it in my area, like on the ag side, they're, getting hoops and, like that. And it was, Bootstrap Farmer, was one of the sites that I was on, getting a lot of information from. And and then I remember I got this hoop from this guy on Craigslist. I just typed it in. I was like, hoop houses. And this guy, I met him and he brought me to this hoop that was in a parking lot. And he was like, it's going to look like that one. And I was like, what do you mean it's going to look like that one? He's like, oh, I have it in a pile over here, And I went back to his house and like, I'm looking at it and I'm looking at the greenhouse from the grocery store or whatever. I'm like, that doesn't look, like the same metal or whatever. But I'm like, whatever. Like, it's cheap. I'm going to take it home. And I set it up and I was like, this is really nice. Like this was only $700 and I have a, 20 by 40 foot greenhouse ready to go frame, still need the plastic and hip boards and baseboards and end walls and all that. But then, started wrapping my head around it and being like, well, if this guy can figure it out, like we could probably do it. And so then, we got a bender and me and a few other buddies started bending our own hoops. And it was like, we quickly realized that one guy should probably bend all the hoops because you end up with like, one guy's bending one side and one other guy's bending another side, and then you end up with a hoop that's kind of like, a little wonky on one side because one guy has a little bend here that didn't, come in the other bend, and like just kind of learning more about like measuring and like just like, keeping things together. And that first year when I bought that greenhouse, I remember I had not something about I didn't pound the ground post in, or I didn't bolt them down enough, but the thing pretty much took off and and like came off the ground and twisted, and was a big pile. And that was when I learned about, like, okay, we gotta refurbish this thing, and we pretty much dismantled it, and now it's still a greenhouse on the farm, but it's only like a 12 by 60 instead of, or whatever, or a 12 by 40 instead of a 20 by 40. But just figuring out how to adapt. And I've always been about just like using scrap wood and doing it yourself, and like finding materials around you that like work, that aren't necessarily the prettiest, but you're gonna you're gonna pull it off. It might not be a lifetime fix, but the next few years it's gonna be fine. And a lot of stuff has held up over the years.
Absolutely. Do you how long until you revisited the freeze dryer? Was that
Um,
did that take time, or was it a quick,
it was about a year, I'd say, maybe a year and a half. Because then, we're putting our food in the freeze dryer, we're making beans and stuff, we're making like sauces and putting, labs in there, and like figuring out some weird, shit about putting stuff in there and inoculating it and doing other, like soups and dried mixes and stuff. And we brought that all down to the Regen conference in 2019, and we're like, we got all our freeze dried gear, it's like we had our herb and stuff, and we showed it to Josh and Kelly. And I remember them being like, man, like this shit's really good, but like, where's your hash? And us being like, like we haven't figured it out yet, And then like at that point, I remember being a turning point, being like, well, there was other conversation during that weekend in realization, and then meeting Josh and Kelly and being like explaining our farm and being like, this is what we do, this is who we are, and this is our direction. And I remember Kelly just being like, well, why aren't you DM certified? And I'm just like, well, I don't know. I was like, I kind of came here to ask that question, I guess. And then, our farm, Swampy Acres, ended up DM certified later that year. And it was, all basically we needed to do was get rid of BHO. And so I just basically went home and was like, we're done with BHO. So I'm going to figure this freeze dryer thing out no matter what. And I remember that year, me and Paisley Acres, we're watching a neighbor's farm, and we're watching their syrup stand, and we had a long night watching the syrup and watching the sap. And the next day we're making hash, and I just was kind of like, man, this bubble hash, nice and water, this really feels right. It was really connecting, and it was just like, this feels good. And like, dumping the material out and just being like, safe, and making it in this, farm's sauna, it was like felt completely, okay. It was like, this is, something right. And ever since that moment, we were like, started figuring out the temperature of I'm not really sure where we ended up getting that tech from, but I'm not sure, where it originally came from. But I remember changing the temperature and being like, man, like this really makes sense, because the stuff we were coming out with was just tacky and like, cooked. It was like coming out at like whatever 70, 80 degrees, the normal temp that was just coming on the free home version freeze dryer. And at that point we're just pressing on kind of like a cheap best value back press, hand crank, just kind of like getting by. And then so we ended up picking the freeze dryer up off of a guy used, here in town. And it was like, we saw it, we're like, all right, we'll snag that up. That's part of the reason why we bought it, was just like, oh, it's a little cheaper and we can trade. And then we ended up upgrading from the best value vac pump to the pure pressure peak. And that's what we run now with the hand toggle. And that was a lot of learning curve, and going back and forth from the hand pump to the peer pressure and being like, man, like I don't want to leave the hand pump because I don't feel comfortable, but then ultimately being completely comfortable and being like, man, this saves a lot of time for us right now, just because like our other press was so small and this one being so much bigger. It's like it was night and day to be like, let's press, 50, 60 grams rather than 7 or 8, at a time.
Can you talk a little bit about that learning curve that it took? Because a lot of individuals are still running that hand pump and really wanting to have that feel and control. And you see guys doing Medusas and hooking 4 up at a time rather than switching over to a more automated. So what was that like for you?
I guess it was just the fact that we got it on, a flower trade. So it was like we got this thing on, for a few pounds, and we're like, wow, like this is a big piece of equipment, after looking it up and being like, this is worth a lot more than a few pounds of flour, like this is something to learn, and like could be something that could be, a skill in the future for production, if we can, figure this out. Like I figured it was like, can't really go much, adding more peer pressures, you know what I mean, would be like, scaling up. But yeah, at that time we were still kind of a little sketchy about the hand pump too, and being like, still having blowouts and it squishing around and moving, and having all those problems. And with the peer pressure, I mean, we blew out so much shit where it was just like, what are you doing? Like coal, not hot enough or too hot, and then for years just being like, well, just crank it up and it's fine, pressing at like 180, or 200 or something, and just being like, well, it all comes out, must be good, and then realizing that's affecting our flavor and our color and the whole shebang, to like, and then, going back to being like, okay, I'm going to put small little bags in the peer pressure and I'm just going to start small. And then doing a ton of presses of small bags on the peer pressure and just being like, well, this doesn't make sense again. I might as well go back to the hand pump. And so then it really took like the ability to have patience and then think about, time and the amount of material you have in the bag to be like, okay, if I'm just letting it, you know, preheat for a little bit of time and I have a little bit of material, it's all going to come out in a few moments, but if you have a lot of material in there, you got to think about that as a whole. And it takes a little bit more for that whole thing to heat up and sweat, and just kind of like knowing that time when it's like, okay, that whole bag is saturated in, oil, is you can open it up basically. And and then being like, is it sliding, is it not sliding, it's a lot, it's actually, quite difficult. But once you get it down, it's almost like it saves so much time and effort, and like I'm just using my fingers, and it's like I'm not even, not saying the hand pump is much labor, or anything, but just like it feels right now.
Oh yeah, at scale, it's a necessity. So I think that's really cool that you went through those paces and learned the techniques and you needed to kind of secure that. But I wanted to ask you, at what point did you connect with Jeff?
Okay, so Jeff, like, I started having the outdoor harvest, so I needed help. So, I'd call in anyone that would come in, and I always knew my buddies, there was this mutual group of friends and they're all really cool, like-minded people, and I'd want them around. So like it was just making the call to have people come up, in the fall and help with trim camp. And then it was kind of like, okay, one year it kind of came up and was like, well, this is kind of, it's kind of working, and would this be something you'd want to do? And then it was, we grew hemp in 2019, on the produce farm that I was helping over, in 2017, 2018, 2019. Finally, we partner and we grow an acre of hemp. So it's like, all right, we have this, big project going on. We need all the help we can. And then that fall, it was kind of a bigger, fall harvest, and it just kind of lasts a little bit longer. And then going into the next year, it was just kind of like that year I had paid someone, and it was, a lot of money out of the bank, but it was worth the time, got a lot of work done. If the hemp would have worked out better, the whole situation would have been a lot better with, multiple business operations, and just kind of, it was a lot. But then just overall being like, hey man, like, you want to come up and like, do this and live the lifestyle, and, kind of just like indulge in, what we're doing, and, take it on, and be part of, your life. And then it was like right before the pandemic and then they're like, hey man, come on, move up, and then the pandemic happened, and it was like, okay, yeah, come up, because otherwise who knows, like we didn't know what was gonna happen. Like we're like, what, like, you better get up here,
What
like,
was
'cause
that like for you, Jeff?
It was crazy, like we just like he, he had been talking all summer, about me maybe coming up and spending the time there after I had been there for harvest that's that time, and always passing ideas back and forth. And it was crazy to just get up there right away and have the time to just spend back, like kicking back with a homie and growing and learning hash and getting down.
I'd have to imagine that it would have been a pretty cool feeling because, like, I don't know about you guys, but when lockdown COVID happened, like, I got really focused on my shit. Like, it was like, all right, like, it is fucking now or never. Like, you focus on some shit and you drive towards it. And so, like, what was that like for you guys? Basically like connecting, linking up, and then basically the outside world shutting down.
I feel like it was definitely good, like honing in on that for sure. Like I had brought, when I moved, a cut of this peanut butter breath that just ended up being a monster plant and just an amazing hasher, super unique like profile of it too, and ended up just like doing really good for us in the bags. And we had just a freezer full of a bunch of good material, from that season too. It was like a lot, and we just put the work in all year, going through the good ones and the bad ones, and found a lot of stuff.
Are you guys separately washing plants and like going through it like that for pheno hunting purposes, or how are you moving through material?
That first that year that we started pheno hunting, we were like, okay, we went hard. Like we bought a lot of packs. Like we put
So
in a
much.
lot of time and effort into being like, okay, what's the parent lineage? What are
A
we gonna
lot of
get?
research.
Like what company we're gonna run with, and like we ended up, and then being like, okay, let's just either freeze it or dry it, because we didn't really have as much freezer space, so we were forced to kind of like dry some stuff and then freeze it and kind of see the differences between that, which was really interesting, like seeing the nuances in the fresh frozen, and then also being like, whoa, this stuff that dried for 5-7 days is also really nice and wet and good in the rosin, and like pressed out really nice. And side by side it was like almost like, like I bet you there's something, there's something in there, where it's like thinking about the head and where it, kind of raisins and where it lies and what kind of oils around it at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of conversation around, does that increase your yield? And then there's the criticism. Well, of course, it's going to show as an increase in yield because you're decreasing water volume in the
Right.
structure. But I mean,
Right.
if you were able to actually analyze that, where you were to offset the water volume reduction, you might actually see an increased yield because of the dried excision point of that gland separating better in the water. But like, I've heard it referred to as Jesus tech. I've heard it a bunch of different names, but I think that's super cool that you've played around with that. That's awesome. So you connect with Jeff. He comes up. It's 2020. You've gone through the hard first couple of seasons of the farm. You work well together. You're in the washroom, working through material. Are you guys? What's prepping for the 2020, is it the 2020 season or the 2021 season?
So after the 2020 season, going into 2021, we started being like, okay, there's obviously certain companies that are gearing themselves for hash,
Yeah.
and they're boasting, we got hashers, and we should run it like this. And so then that year we put a lot of time into stay fly genetics and Kush Kirk. We hunted down a lot of stuff that like we were like, okay, this stuff either A works really well outside and it's gonna hash, or we know that it's gonna hash. So we'll try and figure out if it's gonna work well for us, in the meantime. But we got burnt on a lot of stuff, it was like,
For sure.
it would smell good. It would look like it's got a lot of trichome. It would be beautiful. You put it in the water and you would get like nothing out. And it was like, oh man, like we just pulled light depth a whole season. And all of a sudden, some of the strains that we thought were going to be really nice and loud are like producing, a few grams of rosin. So that was a huge learning curve in learning, like just because you see a lot of heads doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a heavy producer, or like, and then also learning that year, that maybe the heavy producer isn't, a smaller yielder with a very loud terp is gonna, maybe stand out more. So then someone's gonna, come back to you and be like, I just want to grab that, really special terp again. And,
Yeah.
it'll automatically, kind of like people are like, oh, what else you got, kind of thing. So I do, kind of like to, we love keeping around some of them smaller percentages just for the fact that it's so unique that it's like, we love it, we got to keep it around.
Have to.
That's the reward for being a part of the culture. Like, like those small batch, little access, limited run for only the people who understand and appreciate. I feel like that's our reward for being.
Yeah, we like to smoke it,
Exactly. So like, what was the 2021 season like working together? Like, were you living on the farm, Jeff, or like were you nearby, or did you buy a place, or what that look like?
No, I actually moved up, and Josh and his partner were nice enough to let me move into their house I lived in it for the season, and then at the end of the season I had bought a mini house. Basically, it's like a 10 by 12 shack that I put up on the property out there, and it was like basically just down the road. And yeah, that's how it started. Had a little heater in it, my bed and everything else. Shared the kitchen and everything with them. And me and Josh's partner had been friends for a while, like even before Josh and I met, which is really funny, And I was like, I would always known her, and then Josh and I ended up connecting, and then this whole thing ended up blossoming. He invited me on the property and started from there.
Yeah, I met Jamie at Regen, and she's so awesome. I think I met her first, and she like dragged me over, and she's like, "I want you to meet Josh," and I was like, "I want to meet Josh. I want to meet whoever you want to introduce me to." But that's super awesome. So how was that 2021 season? Like, did it go off without a hitch? Were there some struggles? What that look like for you guys?
It was good. Like a lot of learning with the strains that we had. We did put in a lot of research and put a lot of money in the seed bank for sure that winter. Like we came off of it and we're like, we're gonna go for the hash, and we did it. And so we grew a lot of plants, had a lot, that obviously that didn't wash, but we found a lot of really good ones from mainly Stayfly Genetics. We had this really crazy one called Black Band. It was a skunk band from Dominion crossed to Black Triangle, I think.
It's Black Garlic, Skunk, and Headband.
Oh yeah, Black Garlic, Skunk, and Headband. Yep. And so that one was just crazy. It kind of smelled like burnt fireworks, like after after you light the wick. Kind of. It was wild. Super big heads on it too. So that was like something that kind of taught us, where the different sizes of the heads, because we were pulling 160 bags like for our filter basically, and like we're our food grade. And then but this strain and just some like others, you get the big fat heads in the 160 there, and you realize that there's some more filtering to be done in that department, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that always running a full set of bags and then seeing, you know, where everything falls is definitely of value, no matter even if you're just going straight to rosin, just to kind of understand a little bit more about that plant. But um, you know, are you consistently seeing larger heads produced outside than versus inside in the same varietal?
There's like, I don't know, I feel like we've, I don't know, what do you think, Josh? I feel like sometimes we do see bigger heads on some of the stuff. Like we ran modified grapes outside this year and like indoor, um, definitely smaller, I would say. But
It's hard to say because our indoor runs are so small.
yeah, they're haphazard.
Normally they're like just to make sure that our cut is what we thought it was when we brought it in, and then it's like, okay, that one is that one. Like we got a
Yeah.
little bit of head stash. You know, let's then we mainly focus on sun grown annual.
Yeah.
You know,
And
cultivated.
so was 2021 your pheno hunt, or was 2020 your pheno hunt?
2020 was a pheno hunt,
Yeah.
and 2021, like they were both pretty big years of pheno hunting.
And
And
so
that,
what were the standouts from those 2 years of selection?
The modified grapes.
that modified grapes, yep. That black band was phenomenal. Um,
The,
we have, go ahead, Jeff.
I thought was the blueberry watermelon bread
Blueberry,
from Kirk that year.
yep, blueberry watermelon melon bread.
Couple different phenos.
Was there a melon fizz?
That
We had
was
melon soda.
Yes.
Hella seed.
Yeah, dude, that shit was fucking crazy.
That was special.
It was.
I
for
got
sure.
away.
We've been chasing kind of like that, like Sprite kind of terpene, you know, like we've ran a few different ones trying to be like, is that like it? You know, we ran a papaya dog's gift from Kush Kirk this past year, and that one, you know, it's pretty promising. We might be finding something in there that's kind of in that realm.
So talk to me a little bit about how you're cultivating today. Like, you know, you mentioned a little bit earlier, you know, there's been a long evolution and you've been involved in different operations of farming, but like what is your methodology looking like right now on the farm?
Pretty much right now we are just watering what we already have in our beds and just kind of maintaining that moisture level, because it's just basically, you know, keep the biology happy, and it seems to be that the plant is happy. It seems like, you know, we didn't do any compost teas last year or anything out of a barrel. It's just like, you know, if we're doing anything, it's out of the garden head, you know, nozzle. So like doing EM1 is a staple. We do a lot of like IMO collections. You know, we have our wood chip pile that kind of collects the swamp material that comes from the culverts. So like getting in there, collecting all of that every year, putting that on the beds, you know, and inoculating that with all that, you know, just nice mycelium you can visibly see. Constantly putting that back into the beds, you know, as mulch, which like this year was great. We mulched so much that like when I look out there at the end of the year, I was like, man, it looks like it's mulched already, you know, like we pretty much mulched it till it's done, you know. But always more mulch. We do a lot of cover cropping and interplanting, you know. At this point we figured out what crops grow well with the cannabis under the canopy, you know, which ones we can grow for market that work well under the canopy, and you know which ones don't. And like, you know, just kind of like which one, you know, banker plants and hugelkultur is a good key. I think keeping that culture of microbes alive, you know, through the winter is just like they got all that basically a hotel, you know, down there. We use, you know, bokashi pretty much religiously, EM1, um, insect frass, really like insect frass. And, you know, just like we use a lot of natural mystic from Dragonfly Earth Medicine. That foiler, I seem to be a big, you know, staple in our foilers. Just like that. What's that?
The aloe powder.
Aloe and coconut water. Um, but yeah, it just seems like keeping that biology healthy, you know, on the plant and in the soil is just key. and then, you know, adding a few minerals here and there and just kind of keeping it balanced with water seems to be the biggest issue.
How harsh? I'll ask Jeff because Josh it's his property, so it's near and dear to his heart. If you were to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how tough the conditions are to grow on that specific piece of property versus like an ideal condition in, you know, California, or where somebody would picture, you know, what would it be on a scale of 1 to 10?
You know, I mean, that'd probably be like, it's freaking pretty hard, you know. It's gnarly up here. You cannot predict anything that's going to happen in the UP ever, like weather-wise, because we're just surrounded by both. We got Lake Michigan on the south and Lake Superior above us, and the winds are doing every which way kind of thing. So, you know, some days it'll be just 2 weeks of rain for, you know, and 50 degrees outside. So it's just like ideal conditions for mold building. You know, I'd say like it's definitely pretty tough. It's
and
it's fun to work with though, you know. So it's like that's like what we've been always looking for, are strains that can take on these conditions. And
I only ask that to kind of like drive home the difficulty of finding varietals that will express well. Like how difficult did you guys find that pheno hunt to get through and identify stuff that ticked all those boxes for you, finished in time? Like, when do you have to get out in the areas that you're farming in? When do you have to harvest by?
Well, you know, some seasons we have a nice fall where we can, you know, we always have like a really hard time for like a week or so, and then sometimes it'll get nice and you can take a plant, you know, to Halloween if you have heat, you know, in your greenhouse. But we don't have any heat in any of our hoops. So we basically use them like pirate ships, and we open them and close them. And like, you know, this last season we didn't even run fans. So it was like very low, you know, overhead, and just kind of like keeping it to that, like, you know, less is more kind of thing. And we even took the plastic off one hoop, you know, for the summer and then put it back on, where it's like we're getting back to being like, you know, if you baby it too much, it's gonna have the tendency to, you know, be a little bit more prone to molding or stressing. But if you let all that, you know, sun in and the vapor, it's all about the humidity change. You know, if you can let all that humidity out in a big gust rather than, you know, seeping out your greenhouse, and like, you know, naturally, it's all, you know, we get really good wind flow too because we're so close to the lake. So it's like we do get really windy days that are like, I think, helpful in the end of the year. But, you know, it's like if we find strains that end, you know, finish in September sometimes, which is really nice. Like that black band was like September 23rd or something like that. We harvested. We've done pinkleberry, pink dogs. You know, there's a few if we can get a cultivar that finishes before October 1st, it's ideal. But there's been only a few that we found that hash, you know, that finish that early that are worth, you know, growing out, or they'll be too stout, or, you know, there'll be something about them that'll be like, like it's just not going to do it. But after that hunt, I mean, what do we have? Like, we popped like, I'd say 40, 50 different seed packs, you know,
different
more.
strains.
And we had 12 plants, you know, that we were like, these ones can make it to the next level.
Yeah, we had like we had different gardens outside too that were just weren't covered at all. You know, we kind of like went and cut down this this forested lot by Josh's house, and made like a kind of like a half an acre plot around there, and did like a pheno garden down there one year too, and kind of tested out some genetics that we had, and, you know, some made the cut to be hunted through again and got some cuts, and other ones didn't.
Queen Sangria came out of that.
Queen Sangria was really nice. Yeah, Emerald Mountain Legacy is great, like for throwing stuff outside.
They're
tough, resistant.
Those are tough genetics.
Right.
Yeah.
So, you know, were you guys pulling melt, or were you always making rosin, or, you know, what about that?
So we really didn't see much melt, out of our stuff because we weren't really looking for it. We were kind of just like, okay, we're doing full spectrum rosin. Like it just works for us to do, 45 to 160 and we're getting the most for it. And, it's worth it. And then we were like, what was it? The ice cream cake banana dog from Kushkirk was the
Yeah,
first
and then
one.
that, yeah.
We were like, whoa, we kind of like, we're like, oh, we do have a 90 bag, kind of like, oh, we do have a 120 bag. Like, oh, let's just throw them in there. Like, let's see what's going to happen, And then once we did it and separated it and dried it, we were like, okay, this one is clearly different. Let's just try it on the nail, and heard about, melt tests and all that. And like that was the first one that we were like truly like, okay, this one we can call melt at least,
I think maybe we even tried to finger press the peanut butter breath stuff too
Yeah.
at the beginning, like pre even like 90 bags.
Yep, just dry sift, dry.
Yeah.
Yep. But like it's we love melt. Like it's like one of our favorite things, and like we don't really say full melt very often because it's just like I don't know, man. I'd love to get something that someone was like,
Yeah,
this is the full
I want to
melted,
try.
cleanest stuff I've ever seen because we've looked through a lot of stuff and we're just kind of, at that. It's still one Q-tip, clean up type of thing, but like, you know, I just call it ice water hash or melt just to kind of keep that unicorn alive.
Yeah, for the amount of care, energy, and effort, I think we need to move away from the 6-star rating and maybe potentially look at gravimetrics as a way to quantify if we're really judging, cleanliness of melt, and it has nothing to do with terp profile, then, or maybe it's 50-50 gravimetrics, panel of our peers. But I think the melt, I was so super blessed. I got to sit for whale oil at Ego Clash and judge melt. So for me, it was very cool to have that experience and go through such high quality melt so quickly. And yeah, I definitely think that there's room for improvement on that grading scale. And melt versus full melt, or 5.5 versus 6-star. I think
Right.
I think we can do a bit better. But I want to talk a little bit about your lab. You guys talk about you're pulling full spec. Are you still doing that primarily for the market? Or are you separating your bags or your microns now? Or still doing full spec?
At this point, it's like if it's a really rare terp, like tag-along truffle, perhaps, is under 2% on the yield. So it's like some strains, it's just like the terp is so rare, it don't matter if it's a 73 or a 90. It's like we usually always put the 160 in there. So we always run a 190 too as like a catch. And ever since we always run two 220s. So it's like two 220s, 190, 160, and then now it's like we're either throwing the 120 in there and catching the 90, and then that's our melt, and then we'll catch the 73 for the second 3 with the 9, and then take the 90 out and the 120 and just go to 159, or we'll take that, and then it's like we used to do food grade, it'd be 45 to 189 or whatever. And now it's kind of nice because we just do on our last pull, so we only do 4 washes. On our 4th wash, we'll just do full spec. So instead of it just being, it's the 45 from the first, second, third, the 159 up from the first, second, third, and then the full spec. So it's kind of like our, lower tier that we can offer at a very, affordable price. But then still, be like, you're not missing that 90 on that last one. It's not like we're taking it out, the whole time.
Yeah. No, I think that, the drastic difference between like acceptability and food grade needs to, that line needs to be blurred, because, some people's food grade is better than what some people are smoking, and some people's food grade is absolutely, undigestible. So
Right. Yeah.
And yet another one that might need to be discussed, but that's super cool. So are you washing in a stainless steel vessel, or are you washing in a brute? Like or do you have a machine? What's your style?
Go ahead, Jeff.
Are we doing food grade? Food grade cans.
Nice.
Yeah, 20 gals. And we wash with the loose in the 220 bags.
Have you tried the cubes? Have you had any experience with those?
We've had just some other work bags before, not the cubes, and I don't know, I didn't really like it that much. It just felt like you kind of just like mashing the stuff together, and it doesn't really seem like there's enough room for it to move around, but maybe we were just putting too much in it.
Are you like preferential to a certain movement in the water, or do you have like a theory on how those heads are separating? Like, do you think it's temperature based? Do you think it's the vortexing that happens with the water? Do you think it's actually the change of direction and the shifting and bumping that's happening with the ice and the material?
I think we usually just do one direction, counterclockwise. Just put a little bit of energy into it, and it'll fall off.
Yeah. light into the outside. The vortex in the middle. Try to keep it vortexing, and 5 minutes tops, maybe even less sometimes.
Yeah.
That's very cool. I think I tend to kind of lean towards that vortex. It's just like there's something so romantic about it, and it's just like
definitely.
That's what's going on. Do you guys do any jams or like any post processing beyond cold cures, or do you prefer to stay in that cold cure offering?
We've been just typically staying in the cold cure offering just because we really don't have much experience with the jam. We don't really find many cultivars that really dry up too much, but we do have a few, like the modified grape seems to kind of, tend to dry up after a while, a little bit more than we like. So like I can see the, value in having some strains be jammed, but we mainly just stick to cold cure, and we did some fresh press for a while just because it was quick and easy to get it off the press and in the jar. And I kind of dug it a little bit just because like some of the people that were getting it were just liking it so they could take out a little bit, cure it, and they really weren't smoking the whole thing. It's more of like someone who was going to preserve it for, a while and then smoke the jar type of thing, like, but then, you have your people that do enjoy the fresh press, as it is. And there's, value in not having all those terpenes exposed, and I don't know, there's people have their preference. We mainly do cold cure though.
Yeah. But do you feel like fresh press is going to grow in popularity over the next few years?
Maybe for the collectors, I could see, people that are coming out, I could see being like, oh, I have this cold cure and let me smell it and let me taste it, and then be like, all right, I'll take that in fresh press just because I'm going to bring it home and I'm going to let it slow cure in my fridge, or I'm going to do this to it, or, you have your own tech that you want to take care of it at, or, then that nothing has been, happened to it, which like, it's like, I don't know. I think that's what I love about rosin and resin, it's just kind of like fully represents the plant and like how it tastes and the flavor. It's really like, I really like just ice and water on the press in the jar. That's what it tastes like, that's what it smelled like. This is less, we're not really touching it as much as we, it's kind of like hands off approach, almost like.
Absolutely. Are you both? A question for both of you: are you guys rosin smokers or melt smokers? Like, what's your preference, Jeff? We'll start with you.
On the daily, I smoke more rosin for sure, but I definitely enjoy a melt feeling more for sure. Yeah.
What about you, Josh?
Yeah, I smoke a lot of rosin just because I'm smoking a lot of just like, whatever I can scrape up. But if I'm gonna treat myself, the melt is where it's at. Like, at the end of the day, like if I was gonna, so, it's the melt that's gonna treat me. It's like we got a good collection that we save for special occasions, and we've now over the years, it's very rare we don't have a little melt in the freezer just waiting for something.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. Where have you guys fallen for your freeze dryer attempts? Like after you figured, had that, I've had that fiasco more than once. I've ruined a full freeze dryer only once, but yeah, like, have you guys settled on a certain temp that you like to run your freeze dryer trays at?
Yeah, so since we upgraded from the home version, we have the large pharmaceutical now. And, we were playing around with like 5 degrees for a long time, just kind of like long and low and slow. But then I kind of realized that some hash just really will never dry. It's like it takes for, I don't know if it's just our, shelf, the one shelf, whatever, I haven't really explored, the exact shelf temperatures, but it seems like gassier stuff, it's better to dry it slow and low if you can. And if it's like a fruity strain or something, it'll just be like, 20 degrees or 25 degrees, and then it'll just kind of like speed things up a little bit. Sometimes I can't, be keep checking on it over a few days, you know what I mean?
That's super interesting. That's a really cool observation. Do you feel, as somebody who's air dried a considerable amount, do you feel that more terps are lost in a freeze dryer than in a proper air dry?
I mean, since like having the freeze dryer and not really doing much air drying with like the super terpy high end resin as much, so like I haven't really seen that, but from observation and what my mind is telling me, it's telling me that I do want to dive back into that and explore at least air drying, some of the special heads and like making sure that like I can see it, At first I was like, I don't know how you would scale it up, but now I can definitely see, with the right room and temperature and the right rack system, you could definitely X out that freezing and just use a vacuum, or there's definitely a lot more tech to drying than just throwing it in the freeze dryer that I think we'll definitely be exploring, just because luckily we haven't had much problems with our new one, but our old one we'd always have issues where it's down, and it's like we're having problems and it's not sealing and it's vacuum pump this, and then having it take so long and then having to explain to people about the freeze dryer problems. And it's just it's just best lately we've been doing a lot of just our own material and working with our own stuff, and luckily we have enough material to keep us busy, and it's kind of just been nice to just know our own stuff and just kind of not have any questions. But I do agree, I will definitely be in the future, we'll be diving back into more air drying stuff for sure.
That's super cool. I wanted to talk about something you mentioned earlier with your experience with partial drying and then freezing and washing material. Were you able to make any type of observations that were consistent throughout different varietals? Like you were able to sharpen up certain flavor notes with a multi-day hang versus, when compared to that same material immediately frozen, or like, what did you observe?
Go ahead, Jeff.
I think mainly just like kind of noticed like a little bit like of little bit of yield difference maybe, and some of the drier stuff, even like the peanut butter breath held some moisture even longer than some other had done too. I don't know, what else did you think about that, Josh?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, with the motor breath, when we had the fresh frozen versus the
Yeah.
dried, it seemed like some of the nuances in the slightly dried might have been definitely changed
Yeah,
in,
louder for sure.
a little different if it's,
Yeah,
little just that bond of those terpenes rather than them being so fresh. There's definitely
right.
some change in flavor. I'd say the flavor thing would be more of the reason I would do something than the yield, I guess, like,
Yeah,
we did see the yield, though, in that, Gacolina where
yeah.
fresh frozen didn't get anything out of it. Luckily, we dried some of it, and we actually got, something worth out of it, where it's like, but that's not what we're that's not what we're
Mm,
after, you know what I mean? Like, that would be one that would be like, "Get out of here."
yeah.
No, but I mean, pronouncing certain profiles is definitely something that's
Right.
interesting. How different did you have to treat that material?
Definitely, like, it seems to wanna dump with, like, a little more rounds, it would be like, "Okay, instead of running it 4 rounds, we gotta run this one 5 or 6," or something, or being like, it's just like, I'm not sure if, like, it's just like the oil being trapped longer and harder to come off, or just kinda raisined a little bit, of sort, just kinda like from the drying. It was mainly due to just the freezer space, honestly, because now we are doing mainly all fresh frozen. But it is interesting, like, if one doesn't wash fresh frozen, I wouldn't, if you really love it, I wouldn't throw it out, try drying it and washing it because it might, still be just some really nice wet resin at the end. We had some stuff side by side, and I don't think many people could have, told the difference if we wouldn't have said it.
We're seeing a huge rise in resin mixing. Is that something that you guys are doing? Like, are you exploring that?
It's like kind of something that we just tried, I think, in the like 2020 and 2021 season, kind of like we were just kind of like smelling bags that, we had flavors that we thought would go together. So we were putting them together to try to just put a good size wash together in each one. And that worked out for some of them. And then some of them didn't really work out so well. So we like kind of learned, there's different consistencies in each resin, obviously. So like we kind of did one that was a little bit more intentional this season of like we had two phenos of Wilson, the original packs, and Banana Runts Wilson, and then Namwa, which is Banana OG, and Mimosa from Symbiotic Genetics. I think that might have been the only mix, and it came out just smelling kind of like we called it papaya banana smoothie. It came out smelling really good, tasting really good. It was a nice profile, so I feel like that worked out for us. But really, mainly we don't mix. Kind of like to just let the plant be the plant. I think that's like way more badass when you can come to the table with something that just shows out super hard, just as that strain, and that's kind of how I feel about it.
Yeah, especially since we've stepped into breeding too. So it's kind of like now we're like, okay, it gets confusing. And how do you lay it out? If you have all these mixes, it's kind of like, if I'm chasing this genetic, I want to know, you know, I know there's like ands and pluses and like things you can put on your label, but it's kind of like, as a terp connoisseur being like, man, is that the genetic or is that the mix? Or like, I'm kind of like, that part of it puts me off. But like, I can see, as like mixing goes and, people have their own, I like the idea of like putting certain percentages of stuff together, maybe like for a certain person or like someone, that might enjoy that. The one that stood out to me in that 2021 year was when we did the peanut butter apricot from Stayfly, and that one wouldn't wash at all.
Yeah,
So then we just threw that quarter pound in on a big wash of the peanut butter breath, and it was like it almost just stained that whole thing,
yeah,
that like legend orange apricot, flavor. And it was like, I can see something like that like being almost like as long as it's labeled correctly and explained properly to the consumer, it won't get confused, or at least people like me wouldn't get confused.
Yeah, I think that the blends are coming, no
Yeah,
matter if
for sure.
we want them or not. And I think that there's going to be artisanal blends, and then there's going to be maybe less than truthful blends that are done for enrichment. But I think that there's definitely going to be an art to it. I think it's something interesting to talk about. And then there's people who go, oh, well, I'm into blends, but I'd only blend if I'm blending the material and then washing the material. I wouldn't want to blend a finished rosin or a loose resin. And I'm like, oh, that's super interesting too. So it's really cool to get everybody's perspective on it. But yeah, I want to talk about breeding. You just mentioned you've got some breeding projects on the go. Like, I'd love to hear about those.
Yeah, for sure. And to touch on the blending too, like if we were to do blends, I like doing it on the press, just because it seems to be like the best kind of like marriage, of the heads or whatever. But like we have done a wash.
You're mixing the loose resin in the bag.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then when you wash, you can still, look at them separately, get that information, unless it's something you already know, then you throw it in, and like it doesn't matter. But it's always nice to see stuff separately, because you can see it kind of like after it comes out the freeze dryer, there'll be little like sand, marks in the sand, or so to say, and be like, oh, that one's a little lighter, that one's a little darker. Like it's definitely nice having it to blend on the press for us when we do the blends. But for breeding, so our first breeding project was kind of almost like an accidental thing, where it always is, where we're like,
some of the best ones,
right? So we were talking about that black band that we thought we lost at one point, and that year we had the pinkleberry male. We grew out some pinkleberry that my buddy Paisley Acres made that he got from Green Source Gardens when he was out west. And we took that male and had it in our little greenhouse off the house and didn't really think much about it. We were kind of like, whatever, like let's let it ride. And we were going to think we were going to keep an eye on it. Well, it was in a pretty enclosed area, so nothing else really got superseded except for a few different strains. And the black band had a bunch of seed in it, so we're like, all right, let's just save these ones and see what's going to happen. Since black band, we lost the cut, but it was one of our favorite phenos, because at that time what we would do is we'd basically just pop seeds, look at the healthiest ones, give them a little stress test, and then be like, okay, the ones that didn't show any weaknesses, let's just clone those and move forward into the season, and almost like have a stress test type of scenario to begin with.
And ones that finished early too, for sure. That was huge.
So then we get that seeds out of the black band and we pop them, and it's clear when pinkleberry hits something. It's like pink floral buds, like you can, there's no doubt. And once pinkleberry, you can tell its lineage like in anything just about. And it's like, okay, so now we have this florally on the front end with like this meat nasty black band on the back end with a nice purple bud that kind of almost hashes. So we're like, okay, this is a pretty nice start. And then and then the next year, what would that be? Last year, would that be last year after that?
Yeah.
So last season, not this past season, but the one before, we made intentionally, we had the black coffee F2 from Kaya, and we got the male, and we, actually picked a male and was like, this one has nice, structure and a little trichome, and took that specific male instead of doing like an open pollination, like, we were thinking about doing with just like a bunch of males. We're like, let's just take this one. And we put that on the motor breath, and then we put it on the tar pit from Emerald Mountain Legacy, which we still haven't ran through those yet, which could be interesting, with that Chem D Royal Kush with the Black Dog coffee. That one should be pretty interesting. So then that was like, and then we gave them out at the Regen conference, and then people ran them and they were like, man, this isn't some pretty decent stuff. We're getting good percentages. Some people had over 3% yield in the hash, and it had that gas on the coffee, which was like we kind of knew the motor breath was going to really pull through gas, just it's just like kind of perfect, a little coffee, a little gas. Like we were like, that sounds great, it's going to
Like
be
the resistance from that black coffee just like propels it for just being a good outdoor hash strain, like that motor breath just smells like an auto shop floor. I love that terp so much.
yeah, that's how
It's just great. We want the gas.
we love gas for sure. Fuel, anything nasty. So then, we were like, well, that was cool. Like we got good feedback, and maybe people do like, what we do, and we see other people out there, making seed, and, they're affordable. And it's like, that sounds like something we can do. We can put out some packs, that are like, you'll find something that is good. And a lot of our stuff is, inbred lines, we're starting with a lot of stuff that's like pretty stable, and then moving forward. So then the next year we're like, okay, we still have some black coffee seeds. Let's pop those. Then we got males of the black coffee again. And that's when we made, more black coffee F2s and started being like, okay, it's important to save this parent stock in a further form, and then hit some other ones, to get some variety. So we hit the tag along truffle, watermelon, blueberry, melon bread, and I think the modified grapes
Yeah.
coffee. And then we really love that watermelon, blueberry, melon bread from Kush Kirk. So we repopped some of those, got a male, and we crossed some stuff, made an F2 or an F1, and then crossed the tag along truffle, which is like, the cheese terp on that thing is like nasty. I think you remember that from the regen with Paisley Acres. Like,
I do, man. It was incredible, bro.
it's so more. I'm hoping it comes through so hard in that with a little blueberry cheesecake. That's what I'm hoping for. It's not going to yield, but it'll be one of those ones that we'll keep around. But then, we did Dragon's Fist as a male from Kushkirk, which is
the Dragon's Breath times Dosido. The Dragon's Breath is OGKB times his stud male. I forgot I think it's like ice cream cake something. And so it's like OGKB Dosido.
And so then we made some more of those and crossed a little bit of that around. And then we got the Gonzi from Jodri. So that was one that we chose to do a male open pollination. And we hit all of our cuts with that, which, the strains that we found, like they were pretty weird, so like I'm not expecting too much out of that, but we'll see what happens. Like we preserved some of our stuff that's not around, so we'll dig back into that, and it'll be interesting to see.
What do you look for when you're selecting your males?
Well, in the beginning, it was mainly just like, okay, this pack of seeds is kind of rare. There wasn't many of them. Let's go with that. And it was resistant in the female. Like, we ran the female. So we're like, oh, that female is really nice. Like the male of it will be all right. And that's when we do, the idea of being like, okay, run a couple of males and just open up that, gene line. So then you have more options. But as of lately, we're like, maybe we'll get to the finish line faster if we just find males that are more ideal, that will have trichome head, have the structure we're looking for. And I do think it's still ideal to be growing the females of that male just to know like what to look for in that male, because it's like you can see the structure of the female, the flavor, you can see the relationships of the structure to the bud and all that, and then start being like, okay, I identify at least a few of the phenos. Now let's look into the male and be like, do I see those, and those traits and that structure? And like, chances are it's going to be one of those phenos that you liked or close to, or might smell like that one, or chances are,
Somebody who's now actively breeding for resin, do you feel that the plant has maxed itself out as far as the amount of resin it can provide? Or do you feel there's a lot of room still to go with intentional breeding?
It's I don't know.
Right.
I think it could keep going. I don't know. With breeding, and now that we have a direction, and yeah, I'm not sure. It's like sometimes we pick plants for different reasons too. Maybe we'll pick one that's more of a 3 or 4, percenter than something that's going to be a max yielder, just because of the amount of plant it grows, and how easy it is to grow rather than a real small one. It's I don't know. I guess I haven't really thought about that question too much.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like you can only pack so much on a plant, really. I mean, who knows how people do their yields in the first place, anyways. But I don't know. I feel like there's at least we got to be looking for flavors, not really yields. I don't really know. I don't know. A lot of people throw out a lot of good stuff. That's just like how we feel all the time. It's like,
I mean, this leads into my next question, which is, you know, a lot of guys are pretty mixed lines about what they're judging their yields and what the amount that they're or the yields that they're explaining and the information that's being exchanged. Like, how are you guys judging your yields? Are you judging a certain micron level of a certain number of washes, or how do you base those numbers?
I feel like just by like marketable hash, like what we're selling in our pucks and what we're putting out as our product is what our yield is. Like food grade can be, you can use it for so much, but if you want to put out a certain product, then you gotta know what you're getting.
100%. Josh? Do you have any thoughts on it? Like,
Yeah,
it's
I
a
think like usable. Like I like to think about like your highest quality, but then also it's like I still do think about a plant, because I'm kind of like thinking about it in an old school way of being like, oh, we used to get this much for this plant. So then I'm always, being like, well, if I can get this much out of these specs and then the tail ends equal this much, I kind of be like, oh, it's worth it again, or I'll be like, oh, it's kind of like it was, or at least it's not like 500 a plant, or like I'll just kind of like it's almost like I still counting them like that, almost like rather than but we still do, if we're gonna like weigh something, it would be from wet, material, and then we probably wouldn't include like the 189 to the 160 in the percentage, but maybe I don't know, maybe the 45 of it. So we still grade stuff, when we look at it. So it'd be like, is that plant material and gunk, or is it like what is that?
Absolutely. It's a tough question, and I mean it can vary from varietal to varietal, and like. Do you think that that's something that we need to clarify as an industry, or do you think that it's fine the way it is, and we should just let sleeping dogs lay?
It would be kind of nice to have almost like a few standard options set. So if you were to be like, breeding for resin and growing it and making it, you could be like tracking it from the whole, way, and have almost like a spreadsheet of some, almost like a SOP of being like, okay, this is what this one does if you follow this way of doing it. Like as a breeder, it'd be kind of cool to be like, oh, this strain is really nice. It dumps in these bags. This is how much I wash it. This is how much time I spend, and like, and this is what music I play when I'm spinning it, or or whatever. Like, it's kind of cool to have a standard eventually. I would think to really at least so it could clear up the conversations a little bit about what's a yielder, and when people start throwing out these high numbers, I have a hard time believing it is the cream of the crop and not a skewed thing. I don't know.
I agree with you, but then you have guys like Kaya who are 100% credible.
Oh yeah.
Who are throwing out numbers that you're like, okay, well, Kaya just said that, so
Oh,
that's a real number. And
right.
if that's a real number, then everybody else who said that could have a chance that their numbers may be real, because Kaya throws, Kaya
Right.
puts big numbers.
Yeah. I mean, he's the one that's pushing it right now. I mean, maybe that's the standard, whatever.
It is. I
I
think
feel by that.
there's people going, that's not possible. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure Kai's doing that right. But man, that's super cool. So, like, talk to me a little bit about the solventless scene in Michigan. Like, has it grown dramatically? Is it growing year over year? Is it kind of slow to take off? Like, what's the overall scene? Is it blunt smokers? Is it flower smokers?
Well, I guess it's kind of like being where we are. We're pretty much regionally secluded, to where there's a very far and few between of rosin smokers who are specifically like, oh yeah, I only smoke rosin. There's not that many people up here. But then, the scene downstate, like that's been going off for a long time, like the dab houses and, the Vehicle City Social Club, like that scene's been going for a while. And we just kind of were secluded up here where we're like, we're a little bit closer to Wisconsin and Minnesota. And just like, we didn't really get into it down there as soon as we probably should, but we always knew, what was going on watching it on Instagram and stuff. But just recently we started hitting, the swap cream meets downstate, which has been nice because it's like different than other scenes. You don't have any BHO there, so that clears that right out the scene. So then you can almost, start the education there on what you have, and it just is almost like a little niche corner that a guy corn fed has carved out for us, and there's others too, to credit to that. There's once we saw Terp Wizard, Organomelts, Organotron, a few of these other guys downstate building brands. It was kind of like, oh, this is cool. Like, especially like coming from graphic designing in college, and being into arts, it was like, well, this is like the best of both worlds. Almost like we get to say who we are and share our story, and there's a lot more others, and it's like, still, it feels like it's still maturing and expanding, and there's a lot of room for growth, which is great.
How do you think Michigan did as far as legalization compared to other states?
I mean, as far as like legalization goes, I think as long as the caregiver system hasn't been, it's been threatened, but it hasn't been taken away yet. But once that is in jeopardy, then what we're left with is growing 12 plants or whatever, or jumping into the rec where it's like, I feel like a lot of people jumped into the dispensaries. Like a lot of customers were like, oh, like dispensaries are cool, I want to shop. It's kind of like going to the store. And then they realize they're like, wait a second. And then like they come back around again and they're like, whoa, like things are different. It's like the prices are almost merging, and it's almost like, things are a little bit almost better than they were, I would say now. Like people are more educated, and then it's almost like people are advancing faster on what they want in quality, than, so to say, like alcohol or something, but it is still a lot of, a certain person is sodding after, full melt as the same person, that probably only eats a certain way. There's a lot of like layers of how you live your life and what you treat yourself with and how you, use stuff on a daily basis. And, it's just finding the community, and, there is definitely a pretty nice one in Michigan right now. It's just, growing.
Yeah, I was blown away. I mean, I think that was 3 years ago I was there, or 2 years ago. Anyway, it was incredible to see that community, and wasn't huge, but it was very tight knit. So it's really just cool to see that coming together. Do you see a future where Swamp Hash is or yourself are moving into the more commercialized side of it, or are you very happy kind of occupying the caregiver side?
What do you think, Jeff?
I feel like we're pretty happy with the caregiver portion right now. I feel like if there was any way that, you know, I feel like we've talked about it, if we got into the rec market, it would be micro business only, you know, only if we could control how we grow, how we process, how we sell, how we drop, how we do everything, you know, because we don't want to be another one of the people. So that's kind of why we represent the caregivers, because we can give the medicine to the people the way that we feel, you know.
I think, man, I think that's respect, and I think that, you know, it's guys like you that, you know, are going to do it right. And if push comes to shove, and you got to, you know, you do end up going into the other side of the framework, I know you're going to kind of stick to your guns. So
Yeah, the only way would be from seed to sale for sure. You know, it'd be hard to walk away from the plant.
yeah,
You know, I don't think I'd want to be, you know, I'd rather we'd just keep farming, you know, that's really
yeah.
right
Just keep farming, really. Yeah.
now, and dive more into our, you know, already growing interest in our community, you know, with just having connection to that. It's just important. And yeah, there's a lot of things to do, you know, the plant got us this far, and there's a lot of directions now that we can go. And luckily, you know, we're here to at least talk about it.
oh, 100%, man. I asked the questions because I'm purely interested. I felt like I knew the answer to that question.
Yeah. I mean, we do joke around, you know, like having thick skin, being from the north. Like if there's ever a quick, you know, wash job in the wintertime down in, you know, New Mexico or Florida or something, I can do 12 hours and lower than, you know, we go below zero if you want. So maybe, you know, maybe the slight, you know, week in New Mexico or something, but other than that,
The odd cash job here and there.
Yeah.
That's fair for anyone.
we want to see how it's done.
What do you guys think about innovation as far as solventless extraction technology? Like, do you feel for the next 5 to 10 years we're going to be utilizing the same type of systems, or do you think that there's going to be a lot of innovation in this space? As far as actually how we're pulling the hash out, like, are we still going to be using bags in 10 years?
I could see like food grade. You know, it's hard to say. Like, would we go to like screens or something? But is that too rough? You know, the nylon might kind of be, you know, forgiving, or you know, the mesh, the food grade mesh is. I'm not sure, but I do like the idea of continuing the hand paddling, though. You know,
Yeah.
like I really do enjoy the artistry and just the energy you can put into the batch, you know, being a hand stir. And, you know, if you got to get more bodies in there with more vessels, you know, I've seen a lot of material go down in, you know, with 4 or 5 people all turning at once. And it's quite a nice orchestra, you know, to see it all go down. And it's special, you know. It could be different ways, you know. I could see it going a couple different ways. But as far as
do you feel something is lost with the machine? Do you feel that the machines out there can achieve a level of quality that a hand paddle can achieve?
I feel like maybe the yield, you know, and like, yeah, sure, like I believe you can get the same quality, but there's definitely a lot more love in the material when it's hands on, and there's, you know, someone involved, and, you know, there's a lot to do with the vortexing of the water and the energy that goes into that. And I don't know, I feel like the artistry will, you know, it's kind of almost like being a specialty baker and, you know, having to still hand turn some of your certain sourdough or something, you know, to get your, you know, hands in there and your energy into that product. Like, I feel like it'll always have its place for sure.
What about you, Jeff?
I feel like it's the same way for sure. It puts the spirit in the hash when you hand turn. It's just, you know, another part of that, making sure that your product is good down to the last step, you know, keeping an eye on it on every step of the way, you know, not giving it to a machine or anything. But The machines come out well still, but it's just I feel like it's in my head if it is or not. But there's some kind of spirit that evolves in the mixing of the hash.
There's definitely times when we're like, that material's done, where it's like, oh, it's warming up a little bit. You can definitely like have your eyes and hands on it and be like, okay, so it's just not flowing the same, so it's like, oh, it's warming up, or it's not cold enough, or maybe this material's just done, and it's just like, I don't know, there's a little bit of something to say about just having that, hands, just kind of like eyes and hands, connected to the product.
Absolutely. So you mentioned earlier about caregiver rights, and as long as those stay in place, is that something that's currently potentially threatened in Michigan?
Yeah, it's been, thrown around out there that they're gonna, limit patients, and and like I think it was like around 2019, we were still able to sell to dispensaries and bring overages, and it was a nice, safe, transition to supply medicine to people that maybe didn't know you as a caregiver. And once that fizzled out, it was like they brought in emergency laws, and where they were like kept being like, oh, you can keep selling as long as you sign a waiver, or like if you're buying caregiver products at the dispensary, it was on a different shelf. And then they just slowly kind of fizzled it out to the point where it was like, I still believe now you can still get your product in through a processor, if I'm not mistaken, but for something like a we make or something that we're doing, that's kind of why we've stepped into, breeding and getting our imprint into the seed and our flavors and what we're doing that way, because, we have a CBD company, so that's our way into the legal market. It wasn't as profitable as we had hoped, but at least we're there, educating, and we can be in that space. And it's kind of nice, to not have to be operating a full facility or a dispensary or have that overhead, but still kind of have, a product that could be sold and, education to be spread. But it's just like, and then they say, less plants. So like, what if we could only grow 12 plants? Then you're like basically talking about a bunch of hobby growers, which isn't bad. It's still 12 plants, and, there's still an army of people that can grow 12 plants that, it's like, we're almost just like, if we can't be, medicine makers and share our medicine, at least we can share our education and start getting people to grow their own 12 and move in that route, and almost just start more of like a collective cooperative of hobby growers, similar to like home brewers, would do, and, stuff like that. Like kind of like just like, it's almost like legalization kind of brought the cannabis caregiver to light in a bad way, but then almost like stole the light. And now we're almost just kind of like in the shadows, just like they're waiting for us to give up, almost like, where it's like some people did get shoved out and lost a lot. And like, it's, terrible that not everyone has an opportunity to move their product if it passes the state test into a dispensary. Like, that doesn't make sense to me. Like, it was, if it passed, it's deemed good, and now they're like saying, oh, caregiver product is unsafe, whereas like, and then all the product, all the information came out about the unsafe product in the dispensaries and all that. So then it's almost like, I don't know, I almost feel like a market, like a farmer's market or something like that, would be like, what, like it's almost like the event system, but more frequently and more organized, and just like, it could almost happen nationwide, I don't know.
Hey man, I like the idea of that. Like the overall, the North American cannabis market has been going through a tough time, and is probably in a really is in one of the lowest places it's ever been, US, Canada included. Do you think that we're coming out of a dark place, or do you think that we've got a little bit more darkness yet to go through before things start getting better?
It's hard to say, like, if the, corporate and all that and the legalization and all that ends up just stealing the light, but then also allowing, some of us to still operate in our own light, and then they don't just stomp us out. Like, maybe, like, two worlds can exist in the future, but like it seems like there's a little more darkness to go, but I think like hopefully people can have some layers of protection in line already, thinking, as a business and how to move forward, or to, add that layer of protection of going back into secrecy if you have to, and it just depends on what you want for yourself, and if you want to be involved. And there's a whole community of people that are just kind of like operating outside of the norm, and they don't, really, if they're happy. And it's kind of like where you want to be. I don't know. As long as they don't stomp any more people out, it seems like, we should give up on that. It's like, it's hard to say if that's over. I don't know.
What do you think, Jeff?
Oh, whoops. Yeah, I think we just gotta keep fighting as caregivers for education, really, and that's really it. I think educating people about growing, about using medicine, and how the importance of keeping the medical system alive.
So if you're in Michigan and somebody's watching this, like, what is, like, are they have options to seek out caregivers instead of going and seeking out their medicine at a recreational store?
Yep. Right now, still. Yep. You can have 5 patients.
Perfect.
Yep.
That's awesome.
Yep. And then 12 plants per patient.
Beautiful. So, I mean, what's the plan? What's the overall dreams and goals for Swamp Hash and yourselves overall? Like, is it to continue to build out this piece of land that you've purchased and continue to grow? Like, what's your goal with it?
Yeah, I mean, continue breeding and continue, moving forward with multiple avenues. The farm. I know we have a mutual, me and my partner and Jeff and a couple others, of having some sort of like, retreat out here, or some sort of like stay in, bed and breakfast of some sort, and getting that rolling, and kind of like thinking about that as more of like a weekend away that you could book, and then come out with, a better understanding of who we are, and maybe, who you want to be. It's just kind of a cool area we live in. We're right by a reservoir. We're right by Lake Superior. There's a lot of options, a lot of opportunity of hiking and nature, getting reconnected with a lot of that. And also learning, what we do on the farm, and, our strategies and how we grow, and eating our food and cooking it over the fire. And just kind of like, I vision almost just like having the best weekend with some of my friends every so often, every month, and almost just kind of like trying to make that happen as a reality, and somehow like a retreat,
I think
retreat.
that's very cool, man. I think that's an awesome vision, and I'll definitely come visit sooner rather than later. What about you, Jeff? What's your goal with Swamp Hash?
I'd say keep searching through our genetics. Honestly, like I was thinking about it this morning. Like it's nice to have our mothers that we found last year of some of our keeper hash strains, and we put some intention towards the males of wanting to keep them around too. So I think it's building the seed stock, our breeding stock, and then really I think education too. We really kind of want to get into that part for our community, just destigmatizing the plant and getting people to grow. I feel like we've always kind of just talked about getting people to grow their 12 in Michigan, because it's unique that just as a legal rec law that, you can, anybody who has a household in Michigan can grow 12 plants. So, we want to teach people to grow that and teach them about the way that we like to farm too. You know,
That's awesome.
I
I
think
think
education has always been kind of the plan. Like I
it's a
feel
huge.
good to teach, and yeah.
Other than your own, I always like to ask these questions. Like, and I'll start with you, Jeff. What are, you know, say top 5 most impressive flowers or jars that you've seen over the last few months, like that were produced by other farmers, that come to mind?
I like somebody that we always trade with at the events, Magnum Melts. He's got this really good poontang pie, super like kind of like the melon soda, like very like astringent, like electric melon. You know, always partial to the tagalong truffle. You know, for it's like have to be. Yeah, there's Magnum Melts right there.
Oh, that's awesome. Poontang pie.
Yeah. Uh,
The tag-along truffle is incredible. I forgot the name until Josh said, like, oh, Jameson would remember, and I was like, oh my god, it's Parmesan. Like I remember that. So
Great Parmesan.
yeah, it's incredible. So anything else that jumps out at you?
Always Organamelt stuff, like always great, man. He makes good melts. Like his OGKB was really good, and his lemon cane I always enjoy. Yeah, fire stuff from all the Michigan homies, Terp Wizard and
Yeah,
Organic.
the Bicket. We love that
Yeah, the
Bicket.
Bicket, yeah, super good.
Shout out Lime Rising. Nick,
Yeah.
his Bicket is fire.
Anything else, Josh? Any other flavors that come to mind?
Um, hmm. Man, it's hard to say. I always love to trade with everyone at the swap meets, and like, I gotta say the tag along truffle is just like one of my favorite go tos. It's like I smoke a lot of swamp hash, honestly, because
Yeah.
it's like you throw so many flavors that it's hard not to. It's like we got breadsticks from Stay Fly. That one's fire. There's Shit Happens,
Shit happens is fire.
Wedding Flow, bread. It's it, and Wedding Crasher.
Well, what are some of your favorites that you're smoking on from Swamp Hash right now?
We got the Shit Happens, the modified grapes.
What is Shit Happens?
Shit Happens is the It's It Wedding Crasher from my buddy Kindsight, Bo, M.I. Bimbo.
Yeah.
Super floral and like fruity and
Like like berry fruity up front, like floral lilac-y on the back end. Exhale, it's like it's a wild one.
The Armad grapes is like chlorine almost tasting. It's like it reminds me of the YMCA. It's like it's got a terp that's just like it reminds me of just walking into the pool at the YMCA or some shit like as a kid.
That's great. What advice would each of you have for guys trying to follow in your footsteps? Like, Jeff, I'll start with you as somebody, who's been able to line themselves up clearly with the right people and demonstrate a good work ethic. Like, what advice do you have for
I would say if you want to be involved, just start start growing a plant, get involved like any way that you can, and dive into the research, dive into somebody that'll help you out, really, because there's a lot of people out there with open arms now about growing weed, which is great.
Absolutely. Josh, what about yourself? What advice do you have for the young guy who's seeing this being like, dude, I want to be just like Josh? What do I got?
Man, I would say just, live your dream and, whatever it is you want to do, know that there's definitely differences, between what's attainable and what's, fantasy, and, figure out what you actually want and just go for it. And chances are you have enough drive and love, and that would, push you forward. And it might be some tough times, but, just sticking towards whatever that is you want to do, and seem to just keep your nose down and grinding hard.
What was
But
the
don't be afraid to take a break because we all know
Yeah.
that I have ran and we've all ran it down too far.
too far?
I found definitely my
Yeah.
best advice is seriously to just take a break. Honestly, right now would be a good time to relax and just kind of reevaluate what's going on and look at, the big picture of what's to come.
Has there been anybody that we haven't touched on in either of your stories that has been instrumental in your cannabis journey that you might want to shout out as we kind of come to a close here?
Man, I feel bad if there is someone right now, honestly.
Okay, man. It's your time. That's all right, man.
My homies. So some of my homies in Grand Rapids who hooked me up with my cloner when I was first starting to grow. Right away. He's like, "You got to get in on this." It's about
Shout out to those guys. Those homies.
things are
Shout out to
going.
the Grand Rapids.
I'd
Well-
say, shout out just Georgie, the old timer on the
Georgie.
property again. He's taught us a lot. Anyone that helped me in those years, those were some tough years transitioning. And all my other grower homie friends that are up here in the UP, that are just kind of lurking in the shadows, doing their own thing. It's all, it's always nice learning from each other and seeing what everyone's doing.
What's the plan for this season for Swamp Hash? Is it plant more, pop more seeds, or run out these selections, or focus on breeding? Like, talk to me a little bit about that.
Popping on the full moon.
Yeah, we're popping all new stuff. We just axed everything and decided we're gonna start another whole new pheno hunt. So we got a box full of stuff we're about to pop. A lot of our own stuff, a lot of our own creations we're gonna start diving into and seeing what's available and just keep breeding. It seems to be something really inspiring, to be able to spread seed and keep it,
Keep it on the land.
Yep, keep it, under the sun and keep that movement moving strong. It's just something anyone could do in their own backyard and, keep the genetics strong and keep breathing hard.
That's super cool. Where's the best place for people to find you for anybody watching or get in touch with you guys?
Swamp Hash on Instagram.
And is that just Swamp Hash? Just SWAMPHASH?
Swamp Hash.
Swamp Ash.
Beautiful, guys. Well, I appreciate you guys taking the time. Jeff, Josh, thank you for coming on. I really do appreciate it. It was really cool hearing from you guys, and I know you guys are doing, really good work out there. And I've had the pleasure of trying your resin. It's unbelievable. You can taste the care and intention. So shout out to you guys, and appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. Shout out to you too for having us on, man. It's been a while. Good to see you.
Anytime you're welcome back anytime. We always want to hear from Swamp Hash, so you guys have a standing invite. But
awesome.
But yeah, thanks everybody for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Moth New York, January 20th. Still some tickets left. Grab them while you can. Cheers, everybody.